The sheriff's deputy didn't knock. He kicked the door open so hard it swung back and cracked against the wall, and the two men behind him walked straight into the small room like they owned it, because for the next 10 minutes, they did. Evelyn Harper pressed Rosie against her hip before she'd even registered what was happening. The deputy had a piece of paper in his hand, but he wasn't reading from it. He was looking at the room, at the thin blanket on the floor, at the tin cup still holding a little coffee, at the 7-year-old girl who'd gone perfectly still the way animals go still when they sense something dangerous. "You're 3 weeks behind," he said. Not to Evelyn, to the air above her head. "Mr. Callow's been patient. I have money coming. Mrs. Harper." He finally looked at her. "Mr. Callow says get out by noon." Rosie didn't cry. She didn't ask a single question. She reached down and picked up her small cloth doll from the floor, tucked it under her arm, and waited. 7 years old. She already knew how this went. That image, that little girl standing there without tears, without a word, because she had already run out of both, stayed with Evelyn every mile of the road that followed. If this story already has you feeling something, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel was made for. Please take a moment right now to subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Hit the like button if you believe kindness still matters. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to Evelyn and Rosie and find out what happened when the road finally ran out. The morning they were forced out of the rooming house in Caldwell Creek, the temperature had dropped overnight without warning. Evelyn had packed everything they owned into 2 bundles, one large canvas sack she carried on her back, and a smaller one she'd made from an old flour sack that Rosie could manage herself without complaining. She'd learned to pack that way after the second time they'd had to leave somewhere in a hurry. You packed what you could carry, and you let everything else go. Rosie walked without being told to hurry. She kept up, her short legs moving at a pace that was almost a jog, and she held her doll against her chest with one arm while her other hand gripped the strap of her flour sack. She hadn't said much since the deputy came. She'd asked once, quietly, whether they were going somewhere warm. Evelyn had said yes. She didn't know whether that was true. Caldwell Creek sat at the edge of the mountain country, and the road heading north climbed steadily once you got past the mill. Evelyn hadn't planned to go north. North meant higher elevation, harder terrain, fewer towns. But the 2 roads heading south had men on them, men who knew Callow, who ran errands for Callow, who would happily report back that the widow Harper had left and which direction she'd gone. She didn't entirely understand why Callow cared, except that he was the sort of man who needed to feel like he'd won completely. Letting someone simply walk away didn't satisfy him. So she went north into the cold, with $7.40 in her coat pocket, and a daughter who no longer asked where they were going. She'd noticed that change in Rosie 2 months ago, and it frightened her more than the money did. Children were supposed to ask things. They were supposed to want things, and say so out loud, and make their wanting inconvenient, and sometimes exhausting. Rosie had been that child. Before the accident, she'd had opinions about everything, which bowl she ate from, which side of the bed she slept on, whether the beans tasted different on Tuesdays. She'd driven her father half crazy with questions, and he'd answered every one of them, even the ridiculous ones, because he said that a child who stopped asking questions had usually stopped believing answers were possible. He'd been right. Evelyn just hadn't expected to watch it happen. After Martin died, after the foreman came to the door with his hat in his hands and that look men get when they practiced what they're about to say, but still can't quite make it sound like words, Rosie had gone quiet in stages. First she stopped asking about her father. Then she stopped asking about their house, which they lost 6 weeks after the accident when it turned out Martin had borrowed against it to cover a debt Evelyn hadn't known about. Then she stopped asking about school, about friends, about whether they'd ever get a dog. And then, sometime in the last month, she'd stopped asking about most things entirely. She still talked. She still answered questions, still said please and thank you, still told Evelyn when she was cold or when her feet hurt. But asking, the reaching outward kind of asking that meant you still believed something good might come back, that had gone quiet in her the way a fire goes quiet when it's down to just coals. Evelyn walked faster and tried not to think about it. The road climbed through stands of pine that blocked the wind somewhat, then opened onto exposed ridgelines where the cold came in sideways and found every gap in their coats. Evelyn had mended the lining of Rosie's coat twice, But there was a spot along the left shoulder where the fabric had worn thin, and she could feel the child shivering against her when they stopped to rest. "Drink some water," Evelyn said, handing over the canteen. Rosie drank, handed it back, and looked up at the ridge above them. "How far?" "Not much farther." She didn't ask where they were going or what was up there. She just accepted the answer and adjusted the strap of her flour sack and started walking again. Not much farther was a lie, and they both probably knew it. The mountain road was longer and rougher than Evelyn had expected. She'd looked at it on a postal map tacked to the wall of the feed store in Caldwell Creek, but maps didn't show the places where the road washed out or where you had to pick your way along the edge of a drop because some past storm had taken the center of the trail entirely. Maps didn't show the wind. They didn't show what it felt like to carry 40 pounds of everything you owned up an 8% grade with a child keeping pace beside you on empty legs. By midday, they'd stopped 3 times. By early afternoon, Rosie's breathing had changed, a little too fast, a little too shallow, and Evelyn recognized it because she'd heard it before, in the weeks after Martin died when Rosie had gotten sick, and the doctor said it was grief settling in the chest. She stopped and crouched in front of her daughter. "Rosie, look at me." The girl looked at her. Her face was pale under the cold pink cheeks, and her eyes had that slightly glassy look that Evelyn had learned to dread. "Are you sick?" Rosie thought about it. "I'm tired," she said finally, "and my chest feels heavy." "Like when you were sick before?" A small pause. "A little bit like that." Evelyn stood up and looked at the road ahead and the road behind and the trees on either side, and she did a fast, brutal calculation. Going back meant Caldwell Creek and Callow's men and sleeping outside the town limits because there was nowhere else. Going forward meant more mountain and unknown distance and whatever was up there, which might be nothing. Rosie's breathing was the sound of a decision she didn't have the luxury of taking time over. She adjusted the canvas sack on her back, took Rosie's flour sack from her without asking, looped it over her free shoulder and held out her hand. "Come on then, we'll go slow." Rosie took her hand. They walked slow. The trees thinned eventually, and the road curved around the shoulder of a long ridge. And from that vantage point, Evelyn could see a valley below, small, irregular fields, a line of fence that climbed one side of the slope, and in the center of it, a ranch house with smoke coming from the chimney. Real smoke, thick and gray, the kind that meant a real fire and not just embers. To the right of the house stood a barn, older looking, and a series of paddocks where she could make out the shapes of horses. A water trough, a dog sleeping in a patch of pale winter sun near the fence post. She stopped walking. It looked like nothing special. It looked actually a little rough around the edges, one section of fence sagging, the barn roof showing dark patches where repairs hadn't quite kept up with the weather. But the chimney was smoking and the horses were standing, and somebody had that dog, and that meant there was a person down there. She didn't let herself feel too much about it. She'd stood at the edge of other possibilities and had them close in her face, and she'd learned to manage hope the way you managed a bad tooth. Acknowledge it. Don't press on it. "Let's go down," she told Rosie. The girl looked at the valley. "Who lives there?" "I don't know yet." They found the gate at the bottom of the road, a plain wooden affair with a latch, but no lock. Evelyn stood at it for a moment. She was aware of how they looked, road-worn and wind-bitten and carrying everything they owned in mismatched bundles. She was aware that walking onto someone's property uninvited was the sort of thing that got people turned away with nothing, or worse. She was also aware that Rosie's breathing hadn't improved on the descent, and that her daughter was leaning slightly against her side in a way that meant the heaviness in her chest had gotten worse. She lifted the latch and went through. The dog woke up before they reached the yard and barked twice, sharp warning barks, then trotted toward them with its tail at half-mast, cautious but not vicious. Evelyn let it sniff her hand and it settled some, circling behind them like it was herding them toward the house. She knocked on the door. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. Footsteps inside, unhurried. The door opened and the man on the other side looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not hostile exactly, but not warm either. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, broad through the shoulders, with a beard that had grown past the point of intention, and eyes that were doing a rapid inventory of her and Rosie and the bundles they were carrying. "Help you?" he said. "I'm sorry to come to your door without notice," Evelyn said. She'd practiced being direct because she'd found that hesitation made people nervous, and nervous people said no faster. My name is Evelyn Harper. My daughter is sick. She needs to get warm, and I think she needs water, and probably food, and I don't have anywhere else to go right now. I'm not asking for charity. I can work. I'll clean, cook, fix fences, whatever needs doing. I just need one night." The man looked at Rosie. Rosie looked back at him steadily, not pleading, not performing, just looking, the way she'd learned to look at adults who were deciding things about her. He rubbed the back of his neck. He looked out past them at the road as if checking whether there was someone behind them. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. "Wipe your feet." His name was Silas Thornton, and he told her that while he was putting water on the stove, not because he was being friendly, but because she'd asked and he answered questions directly. He didn't ask many in return. He showed her where the wash basin was and gave Rosie a blanket without being asked, watched the child wrap herself in it without expression. "How long has she been breathing like that?" he said. "Since this afternoon. She had something similar last winter. There's a doctor in Millhaven, 12 miles east." "I know." She didn't say that she couldn't afford the doctor, or that she'd tried 2 doctors in the last 4 months, and both had been paid in portions, and she still owed on the second one. She just said, "I know," and left it at that. He looked at her like he'd heard what she didn't say. He heated soup, canned, nothing special, the kind of soup that came from a tin and tasted exactly like it came from a tin, but it was hot, and there was enough of it. He put a bowl in front of Rosie, and she ate without commenting on whether she liked it, which she once would have done. He put a bowl in front of Evelyn and poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across the table, not eating, just drinking the coffee, and not looking at them in a way that felt deliberate, like he was giving them space to eat without being watched. "Thank you," Evelyn said when Rosie had finished most of her bowl. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "I didn't decide anything yet." She appreciated that. She was tired of people who made her feel grateful before they'd earned it. "What do you need done on the ranch?" she asked. He looked up at her over his coffee cup. "You asking for a job or asking for a list so you can convince me you're useful?" "Both." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, his face didn't seem to do that easily, but something adjacent to it. "Fences need work on the north side. Chickens need tending, and I'm bad at it. I forget mornings. There's mending that's been sitting for 2 months, cooking. I can cook for myself, but I'm not good at it, and I know it. I can do all of that. What do you want in exchange?" "A room until spring, food for my daughter, and whatever you think fair to put toward—" She stopped, reconsidered what she'd been about to say. "Toward getting back on our feet." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Outside, the wind had picked up and was throwing itself at the north wall of the house. "You said you came from Caldwell Creek. What happened there?" She told him about the rooming house. She didn't go into Callow specifically, but she mentioned the deputy and the door being kicked and the 3 weeks' rent she'd owed. "This Callow," Silas said, which meant he'd heard the name even in what she hadn't said. "He have a reason to come looking for you?" "He has the kind of personality that likes to finish things," Evelyn said carefully. "Is he dangerous?" She considered lying and decided against it. "He has people. He doesn't do things himself." Silas nodded slowly, like he was filing information. "All right," he said. "All right, you'll think about it. Or all right, you can stay. Tonight for certain. We'll talk about the rest in the morning when I know if your daughter's better." He got up and rinsed his cup at the basin. "There's a room at the end of the hall. Bed's made. I'll get more blankets." He paused with his back to her. "I'll send someone to get the doctor tomorrow. Don't argue with me about the cost." "Mr. Thornton, it's Silas, and I said don't argue." She didn't argue. She was too tired and Rosie was too sick, and outside the wind was doing what wind does in the mountains in late fall, which is remind you exactly how small a human body is and how much the world doesn't care about it. She helped Rosie to the room and got her coat and boots off, and her into the bed, and when Rosie was settled with the blankets up to her chin, she sat on the edge of the mattress and listened to her breathe. Better. A little better, just from the warmth and the food. "Mama," Rosie said. "Yeah." That man, he's not mean." "No," Evelyn said, "he's not mean. He has a dog." "I saw." Rosie was quiet for a moment, then, "The dog has one ear that goes up and one that goes down." Evelyn hadn't noticed. "Does it?" Rosie's eyes were already closing. "I like that." She was asleep in a few minutes, her breathing slow and steadier than it had been on the road. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed a little longer than necessary, watching her chest rise and fall, counting the breaths the way she had when Rosie was a baby, and she'd been too anxious to stop watching. Then she got up and went back to the main room. Silas was sitting in the chair by the window, not reading, not doing anything, just sitting the way a man sits when he's used to the silence. He looked up when she came in. "She's sleeping," Evelyn said. "Good." She sat down at the table and didn't know what to do with her hands, so she folded them and put them in front of her. "You said you'd send for the doctor. You don't know us. You don't know anything about us except that we showed up at your gate." "That's true." "Why?" He looked at her for a moment, then out the window at the dark. "About 7 years ago," he said, "my wife died. February. Bad February. I was in pretty poor shape afterward, not just grieving, I mean really poor shape. Made some bad decisions, got behind on everything. A man named Cutler, from the settlement east of here, brought me a side of beef one afternoon. Didn't say much, didn't ask any questions, just left it and went home." He paused. "I never really understood why he did it. He didn't know me well. But He stopped again. "It changed the calculation somehow. Like knowing someone would do that without a reason made the rest of it more bearable." Evelyn didn't say anything. "I'm not saying I'm doing this because of that," he added, a little awkwardly. "I'm just saying it's not entirely without precedent. Did you ever pay him back, Cutler?" "Tried to. He wouldn't take anything." Silas picked at a place on the arm of the chair where the leather had worn. "Said it didn't work that way." They sat in the quiet for a while. Outside, the wind continued its argument with the walls. "Tell me about the fences on the north side," Evelyn said. "I want to know what I'm actually signing up for." Something in his posture shifted, a kind of relief maybe, that she was practical. He started talking about the fences, and she listened carefully, asking specific questions, taking a kind of inventory in her head. He answered her without condescension, which she noticed and appreciated, because she'd spent months being talked to like a woman who didn't understand practical things, and she understood them fine. They talked for almost an hour. By the end of it, she had a clearer picture of the ranch, and he had a clearer picture of what she could actually do. And neither of them made any big declarations about it. Just two people figuring out whether an arrangement could work. "I'll start in the morning," she said, assuming Rosie is well enough. "Start when you're ready to start," he said. "No rush." She went to bed. The mattress was softer than anything she'd slept on in 4 months, and she lay rigid in the middle of it for 20 minutes, certain she'd be awake all night, and then fell asleep so completely and so suddenly that she didn't remember closing her eyes. She woke to the sound of Rosie's voice. Not crying, talking. Evelyn was on her feet and in the doorway before she'd fully registered what she was hearing, and what she was hearing was Rosie, in the kitchen, talking to Silas. She stopped in the doorway. Rosie was at the table. Silas was at the stove. The dog, the one with the mismatched ears, was sitting next to Rosie's chair, and Rosie had her hand on its head in the deliberate way children pet animals when they're trying to be careful and good about it. "His name is Bishop," Rosie was telling Silas. "Why Bishop?" "He has a serious face," Silas said, without turning from the stove. Bishop seemed right. Rosie examined the dog's face seriously. "He does have a serious face," she agreed, "even though one of his ears is wrong. Both his ears work fine. One just points a different direction." "Like it's listening to something else," Rosie said. Silas turned from the stove then, just enough to glance at her. "Yeah," he said, and his voice had something in it that Evelyn couldn't entirely name. "Like it's listening to something else." Evelyn stepped back from the doorway. She pressed her back against the wall in the hallway and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, because she hadn't heard her daughter talk like that, easy and curious and reaching outward, in so long that it hit her somewhere she wasn't prepared for. She stayed in the hallway until she was sure her face had settled, and then she walked into the kitchen and said good morning and accepted the coffee. Silas poured her without being asked, and she sat down across from her daughter and watched Rosie eat her breakfast and talk about the dog's ear. And she didn't say anything about being grateful because it was too big and too raw, and she didn't trust herself to say it without embarrassing everyone. She just drank her coffee and listened to her daughter ask questions. The doctor came that afternoon, a tired-looking man named Garrett, who had the manner of someone who'd given a great deal of difficult news over a long career and had found that directness was kinder than softening. He examined Rosie for 20 minutes while Evelyn stood in the corner of the room and held her hands still with effort. "Lungs are clear," he said when he came out. "She's got some inflammation in her chest, common in cold exposure like this. Not serious if she stays warm and rests. She should stay inside for a week at minimum." He looked at Evelyn. "She's also underweight. How long has she been under eating?" The question landed harder than she expected. "A while," Evelyn said. "She needs regular meals. Dense, eggs, fat, not just bread. Her body's been running short for some time." He said it without accusation, which made it worse somehow. "She'll bounce back fast if you can manage it. Children her age usually do." "Thank you," Evelyn said. He nodded, snapped his bag closed. "Silas?" He looked at the man standing in the doorway. "You've always been better at finding strays than you let on." Silas said nothing, just moved to let him pass. After the doctor left, Evelyn found Rosie sitting up in bed with Bishop on the floor beside her, and a somewhat battered book in her lap, a collection of folk stories with the cover half off that she hadn't had before. "Where did you get that?" Evelyn asked. "He brought it," Rosie said. "He said he'd had it a long time and didn't need it." She looked at her daughter's face as she bent over the book, the color in her cheeks better already, the slight furrow of concentration as she worked through a word she didn't know. And then she looked away because the feeling in her chest was too large to fit in a kitchen doorway. She went outside and found Silas at the fence on the east side of the yard, mending a section where a post had come loose. She walked over and picked up the other end of the board he was trying to set and held it in place while he drove the nail. "Thank you," she said. "For the book. And for the doctor." He drove another nail. "She's going to be fine." "I know." She held the board steady. "She talked this morning, properly. She's been very quiet lately. Didn't ask things. And this morning she talked about the dog's ear for about 10 minutes. Silas set the hammer down for a moment. He looked out over the valley below the fence line. "Kids go quiet when they've been disappointed enough times," he said. "It's not permanent, just protection." Evelyn looked at him. "How do you know that?" He picked the hammer back up. "I went quiet for 3 years after my wife died," he said. "Then someone left a side of beef on my porch, and I started talking again." He drove the last nail, tested the board, nodded. "There are about 40 more of these on the north fence," he said. "You said you could do fence work." "I said I could fix fences." "That's what I said." He handed her the hammer. "You want to start now or after lunch?" Evelyn looked at the hammer in her hand. "Now," she said. "Let's start now." They worked until the light went thin. She drove nails and reset posts and learned quickly which sections were load-bearing and which were cosmetic, and Silas answered her questions and didn't explain things twice unless she asked him to. He was better company than she expected. Not talkative, not particularly warm, but present and practical and honest, which she had learned to value above charm. In the house, through the window, she could see the lamp burning in Rosie's room. She could see the outline of the child in bed with the dog's dark shape at the foot of it, the book propped open on her knees. She drove another nail. She was not going to make anything of this yet. She was not going to let herself want anything. She had learned, the hard, repeated way, that wanting something before it was solid got you nothing except one more thing to grieve when it fell apart. But she drove the nail straight, and she set the board true, and she stayed until the light was fully gone. And when they walked back to the house together through the cold, she noticed that Silas left the barn lamp on for the horses, which meant he was the kind of man who thought about whether animals were afraid of the dark. She filed that information away without deciding what to do with it. They had dinner. Rosie ate more than Evelyn had seen her eat in weeks. She told them, unprompted, about a story in the book, something involving a bear and a fisherman and a very poor decision the fisherman made, and she got the details a little mixed up, but she told it with enthusiasm, and that was the important part. Silas listened. He didn't rush her. When she finished, he asked what happened to the bear, and Rosie said she hadn't gotten to that part yet, and he said he'd like to know when she did, and she said she'd tell him. Evelyn cleared the dishes. She was standing at the basin when she heard Rosie say, quietly, in the other room, "Mr. Thornton, do you think the spring will come back to the mountain if it went away?" A pause. "What kind of spring?" Silas said. "Like water, like a spring of water underground. My papa told me some mountains have them." "Your papa was right. Mountains do have them." "If one dried up, could you find it again?" Evelyn stood very still at the basin. Depends, Silas said slowly. Sometimes the water moves, finds a new way through, but it doesn't usually disappear entirely. It's still in the rock somewhere. You just have to know where to look. Silence from Rosie. Then, how do you know where to look? You don't always, he said. Sometimes you just pick the place that seems right, and you start digging. Evelyn set down the dish she was holding and looked out the small window above the basin at the dark shape of the mountain against the darker sky. She didn't know what her daughter was asking, exactly. She wasn't sure Rosie knew entirely either, but she stayed at the window for a long time after the house went quiet, and she thought about springs in rock and water that moves and finds new ways through, and she didn't let herself want anything specific. She just stood there in the kitchen with her hands damp from the washing and the lamp burning low on the counter, and she listened to the mountain wind do what mountain wind does. And she stayed. The first morning, Evelyn worked the north fence alone. She found 17 posts that needed resetting and 3 sections of rail that were past saving and needed full replacement. She made a list on the back of an envelope she'd found in her coat pocket. The same envelope that had once held a letter from Martin's foreman telling her that the company accepted no liability for accidents occurring beyond the designated work zone. And she wrote the numbers down in her careful hand and brought the list to Silas at noon. He looked it over without expression. That's about what I figured. The wood for the replacements. Do you have stock in the barn, or do you need to order? There's in the barn, not enough. He folded the envelope and put it in his shirt pocket. I'll drive to Millhaven end of the week. I can go with you. Help load. He glanced at her. You don't need to do that. I know I don't need to, she said. I'm saying I can. He held her look for a moment, then nodded. End of the week, then. She went back to the fence. The cold was sharp but workable, and she'd found a rhythm with the post setter that suited her. 2 strikes to test, 3 to seat, 1 final check for plumb. Martin had taught her fence work the summer they'd moved to the mining claim, insisting that knowing how to build something from the ground up was the only real insurance a person had. She'd resented learning it at the time. She thought about that now, driving steel into frozen ground, and felt the particular bitterness of being grateful to a dead man for things he'd never know he gave you. At noon, she went inside to check on Rosie and found her not in bed where she was supposed to be, but sitting at the kitchen table with Bishop's head in her lap, carefully drawing something on a piece of brown paper with a stub of pencil. You're supposed to be resting, Evelyn said. I am resting, Rosie said. I'm sitting down. You're supposed to be in bed resting. Beds are boring. She didn't look up from the paper. Mr. Thornton said I could sit here if I stayed warm. Evelyn turned to find Silas in the doorway of the back room, holding a bridle he'd been cleaning, with an expression that was somewhere between neutral and braced. She was going to try to come outside, he said. This seemed like a better arrangement. She's supposed to stay in bed. The doctor said stay warm and rest. She's warm. She's sitting. He paused. She's not in bed, but she's also not outside in the cold trying to carry water to the chicken pen, which is what she told me she was planning. Evelyn looked at her daughter. Rosie looked back at her with the expression of a child who knows she's been caught in a reasonable position and is waiting to see if reason will prevail. What are you drawing? Evelyn asked finally. A map, Rosie said, of the ranch. Mr. Thornton showed me where everything is from the window. I'm making sure I have it right. She pushed the brown paper across the table. It was in fact a map, rough and out of proportion, but identifiable. The house was a square in the middle. The barn was a rectangle to the right. Small circles represented trees, and the fence line ran in wobbly stripes around the perimeter. In the upper left corner, she'd drawn a question mark. What's the question mark? Evelyn asked. That's where the north fence goes. I don't know how far. Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest. The map was meticulous in the way Rosie used to be meticulous about things, before, when she'd cared enough about understanding something to get it right. You can ask Mr. Thornton where the north fence ends, she said. I already asked. He said far. Rosie reclaimed her paper. That's not a useful answer. From the doorway, Silas made a sound that was possibly a cleared throat and possibly something else. He went back to cleaning the bridle. Evelyn heated soup and sliced the bread she'd made that morning, a dense, rough loaf that wasn't as good as she could do with better flour but was solid enough, and the 3 of them ate lunch at the kitchen table without much conversation. Rosie ate the soup and most of her bread and fed small pieces of crust to Bishop under the table, which Evelyn pretended not to notice because the dog was skinny and Rosie was eating, and sometimes you picked which rules mattered today. The chickens need names, Rosie announced. Silas looked up. They have names. What are they? A pause. The one with the dark feathers is named Trouble. What about the others? He set down his spoon. The others don't have names. Why not? Because trouble was causing enough of it that I didn't get around to the others. Rosie considered this. I'll name them, she said. You're resting, Evelyn said. I can name them from the window. Silas picked his spoon back up. He was hiding something in his face, Evelyn noticed, pressing something back. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but she'd started to notice he did that. When Rosie said something that caught him sideways, there was a moment where his face moved towards something and then stopped, like a door that opened an inch and then held. She went back to the fence after lunch. The afternoon was gray and still and colder than the morning, and she worked until her hands ached through the gloves, and then she kept working because the north fence wasn't going to fix itself, and she had promised a job and she intended to do it. When the light started going, she heard footsteps behind her, light ones, and turned to find Rosie picking her way along the frozen grass toward her, bundled in her coat with a scarf wrapped twice around her neck, carrying a tin cup with both hands. You're supposed to be inside, Evelyn said. Mr. Thornton said if I put the scarf on, I could bring you this. She held out the cup, coffee, still hot. He made it himself. Evelyn took the cup. She looked past Rosie toward the house, where the kitchen window showed a lamp burning and a shape moving behind it. He did. He didn't want to walk out here himself, Rosie said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child reporting a fact. I don't know why. Evelyn drank the coffee. It was strong and slightly bitter and exactly what she needed. Go back inside before you get cold. I'm already a little cold. Then go back inside. Rosie went, taking small, careful steps back over the frozen grass. Evelyn watched her until she was through the door, and then she turned back to the fence post she'd been resetting and drove the final stake with more force than was strictly necessary. She drank the rest of the coffee standing at the fence with the cold coming down from the ridge. And she did not think about the man in the kitchen who had made it, and then sent a 7-year-old to deliver it because he hadn't wanted to walk out himself. She did not analyze what that meant. She finished the coffee, set the cup on a fence post, and worked until she couldn't see the nails anymore. The week settled into a shape. Evelyn was up before Silas most mornings, had the stove going and water heated by the time he came through, and he accepted this without comment except to pour his own coffee and stand at the window for 5 minutes before he said anything to anyone, which she understood was just how he was and gave him the 5 minutes without trying to fill it. She learned quickly that he was not a difficult man to read once you understood that his silences were not hostile. He just didn't talk unless he had something to say. Coming from a life with Martin, who had been warm and easy and full of words, it took her some adjusting. But she adjusted. Rosie got better in stages. First she stopped coughing in the night. Then she started eating without being watched. Then she asked Silas to show her how to collect eggs from the chickens. He showed her. She came back in with 4 eggs and a small cut on her thumb where Trouble had objected to the intrusion, and she held the thumb up and said, "Trouble is a bad name, it's too nice," and announced she was renaming the chicken Rotten. Silas said Rotten was a fine name. Evelyn disinfected the thumb without mentioning that she'd specifically told Rosie to be careful with Trouble. The chicken was renamed. On the 4th day, while Evelyn was working in the kitchen and Silas was in the barn, Rosie came to find her with an expression that Evelyn recognized. The careful, arranged expression she'd worn ever since Martin died when she was about to say something she'd been holding for a while. "Mama." "Yeah." Rosie climbed onto a chair and sat with her hands in her lap. "Are we going to stay here?" Evelyn kept her eyes on the bread she was kneading. "For a while." "How long is a while?" "I don't know yet, Rosie. Is that because you don't know, or because you're worried it won't work and you don't want to say so?" Evelyn stopped kneading. She turned and looked at her daughter, this 7-year-old who had her father's directness and her mother's habit of seeing through things, and she thought about giving a careful answer and decided against it. "Both," she said. Rosie absorbed this. "I think it will work," she said. "You do. He's not mean. He doesn't want us to leave. He made coffee for you and didn't want to walk out himself because he's shy, but he still wanted you to have it." She was very matter-of-fact about all of this, like she was reading evidence. "And he lets me name the chickens." That's a lot to draw from some coffee and a chicken naming. I also think Bishop likes us, Rosie said. Dogs know things. Dogs know things, Evelyn repeated, turning back to the bread. I'm just saying, Rosie said, and climbed down from the chair and went back to her map. On the 5th day, Silas mentioned the well. He said it the way people say things they've been putting off saying, fast, at the end of a different conversation, like it had less weight than it did. They'd been talking about the fence lumber, and whether the trip to Millhaven could wait until after the weekend, and then he said, "The well's been running low, I've been meaning to say." Evelyn looked at him. How low? Lower than it should be for this time of year. He looked out the window. It happened last fall too, but it came back. I figured it was seasonal. And now? Now it's lower than last fall. He rubbed the back of his neck, which she'd come to recognize as the thing he did when he was uncomfortable. If it keeps going, by winter I could have a problem with the livestock. The horses need how many head? 7 horses, 4 cattle. The chickens. He paused. It's not just me I'm worried about. She understood that he was also worried about her and Rosie, that this was his way of saying it without saying it. Have you had anyone look at it? Someone who knows wells? There's a man in Harrow who does. I sent for him last year. He said the water table was shifting. Did he say why? Said he didn't know. Could be the mine operation east of here. Could be natural movement. He was quiet. Said if it kept dropping, I might need to look at drilling a new well. That kind of money. He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence because he didn't need to. The kind of money a new well cost was the kind that could take down a ranch operating on small margins. Evelyn sat down at the table. She turned her cup in her hands. You should have told me sooner. You've been here a week. You should still have told me sooner. She meant it practically, not as a reproach. She needed to know what kind of situation she was actually in, not the one that looked survivable from the outside. How long do we have before it becomes critical? Hard to say. If the drop continues at the same rate, maybe 6 weeks. Could be faster if we get a freeze that goes deep. 6 weeks. She ran the numbers in her head without showing she was doing it. All right. I'm not saying you should leave, he said. I'm saying you should know. I'm not planning to leave, she said. I'm thinking. He was quiet and let her think. She appreciated that about him. The Harrow man, the well specialist. He said no option besides drilling? He said that was the practical option. He mentioned springs. Silas paused. Said sometimes mountain properties have groundwater that can be accessed other ways, but finding it is… He made a gesture. Not certain. Have you looked? I've walked the property. I don't know what I'm looking for. Neither do I, Evelyn said, but I'd like to walk it anyway. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, part surprised, part something else. Why? Because looking costs nothing and doing nothing costs the same. She stood up. Tomorrow. You can show me the property lines. He nodded slowly. Tomorrow, then. They drove to Millhaven 2 days later, Evelyn and Silas in the wagon with Rosie in the back wrapped in a blanket. Sitting between the empty lumber space and a crate of eggs Evelyn was planning to sell at the general store. Rosie had campaigned aggressively to come and won primarily on the medical grounds that the doctor had said fresh air was beneficial, which was technically true, and also a creative interpretation of what the doctor had meant. Millhaven was larger than Evelyn had expected. A proper street with a bank, a hotel, a general store, a feed supply, and 2 establishments that operated behind plain wooden facades and were clearly saloons, though neither had a sign saying so. The kind of town that had stopped pretending to be small, but hadn't quite decided what it was instead. Silas pulled up at the feed supply and jumped down and began talking lumber specifics with the man behind the counter, and Evelyn took Rosie to the general store with the egg crate and negotiated a fair price with the woman at the counter, who looked at the eggs with the practiced suspicion of someone who'd been given bad eggs before, and wasn't going to be gracious about it until she was sure. These from Thornton's place? The woman said. Yes. She looked up. You're the woman he took in off the mountain road. Evelyn kept her expression neutral. I work on the ranch. The woman turned an egg in her hand. People in town have been wondering. Wondering what? Whether he'd finally… She stopped, seemed to reconsider. He's been alone up there a long time, since Clara. His wife, Evelyn said. 7 years. The woman set the egg down. These are good eggs. I'll give you 40 cents a dozen. 50. A pause. 45. Done. The woman counted out the coins. He's not easy to know, she said, not looking up. Silas, in case you hadn't noticed. I'd noticed. He wasn't always like that. She slid the coins across the counter. Clara dying. It took something out of him. He used to come to town every week, then every 2 weeks, then almost never. She finally looked up. Your girl is pretty. Rosie, who had been examining a display of hard candy with focused attention, looked up at the mention of her and smiled politely. Thank you, Evelyn said. She looks like she's feeling better. Evelyn took the coins. She is. She gathered Rosie and the empty crate and walked back to the wagon, turning the conversation over in her head. The woman hadn't been malicious. She'd been curious in the way of small-town people who watched a man go from present to invisible over 7 years and wanted to know what the change meant. Evelyn understood that kind of watching. She'd been watched the same way after Martin died, except the watching had been less charitable. The widow who couldn't keep a roof, who moved from place to place, who clearly couldn't manage. She helped Rosie into the wagon and sat up on the seat, and when Silas came back with the lumber loaded, she didn't tell him about the conversation. It wasn't her information to do anything with. On the way home, Rosie fell asleep in the back against the rolled blanket, and the road climbed back into the mountain quiet, and after a while Silas said, without looking at her, "What did she tell you?" Evelyn turned to look at him. "Who?" "Margaret Purcell, at the general store." He kept his eyes on the road. "She tells everyone things. She said the eggs were good." A pause. He knew she was editing. He didn't push it. After a mile, he said, "Whatever she told you, I'm not whatever she said I was." "She said you used to come to town every week." He was quiet. "She didn't say anything unkind," Evelyn added. "She was just explaining." She wasn't explaining. She was constructing. He shifted the reins in his hands. People do that when they don't have all the information. They fill the gaps in and call it understanding. Don't people do that about you, or do you think you're the exception? The question came out sharper than she'd intended. She watched him absorb it. "I do it too," he said, after a moment. "I know that. What gaps do you fill in about me?" She wasn't sure why she was asking. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. He thought about it. Actually thought, not just making conversational noise. "I assumed the first night that you were running from the man you mentioned, that there was more to it than rent." "There is. I assumed you'd been turned away enough times to stop asking directly for help, which is why you came in with the work offer right out of the gate." Also true. "And I assumed—" He stopped. "I assumed you were more afraid than you let on. About your daughter." The road curved and the valley opened below them, the ranch visible in the late afternoon light with the smoke from the chimney and the horses in the paddock, and Evelyn looked at it and thought about fear and how it lived in your body in the months when things were bad. How you got good at the face that said things were manageable, while your hands went cold every time your child coughed. "All right," she said. "What were you wrong about?" He considered. "I thought you'd be harder to work with." She looked at him. "I thought someone who'd been dealing with bad situations for a long time would get defensive when corrected. You don't. You just adjust." "Being defensive is expensive," she said. "I stopped being able to afford it." He nodded, like that made complete sense to him. They drove the rest of the way without talking, and the quiet was not uncomfortable. Rosie woke up just as they pulled into the yard, sat up in the back with her hair flattened on one side and her scarf half unwound, and said immediately, "Did anyone feed the chickens while we were gone?" Silas jumped down from the wagon and tied off the horses. "Pete was supposed to." "Who's Pete?" "The man I pay to help on the ranch when I need an extra hand." "I didn't know there was a Pete," Rosie said. "You've been here a week." "Does Pete know that Trouble's name is Rotten now?" Silas untied the back flap of the wagon. "I'll make sure he's informed." Evelyn climbed down and began helping unload, and Rosie climbed down and went directly to the chicken pen to verify that the renaming had been communicated properly, which was not how Evelyn would have prioritized the afternoon, but which was, she supposed, a sign of an improving child. Pete turned out to be a lean, weathered man in his 60s who showed up the following morning with a horse and a handshake, and the manner of someone who had known Silas long enough to stop trying to make conversation with him before coffee. He accepted the introduction to Evelyn with a nod, took in the situation with a single sweeping look that lasted about a second and a half, and said nothing about it. She liked him immediately. He and Silas spent the morning on the barn roof fixing the patches that hadn't held, and Evelyn could hear them up there. The steady rhythm of hammering, occasional short exchanges, the kind of talking that happened between men who'd worked together long enough to talk about the work, and not much else. She split her time between the fence and the kitchen, making a proper meal at midday because Pete had the look of a man who worked through lunch if you let him, and she wasn't going to let him. Rosie set the table. She did it carefully, the way she'd started doing most things at the ranch. With attention, like the setting of the table mattered, like all of it mattered. Evelyn watched her straighten a fork that was already straight and felt the tightness in her throat that she'd been managing for days. At lunch, Pete ate his food and looked at Rosie's map, which was now considerably more detailed and had been extended on a second piece of brown paper that Silas had provided. "That the north fence?" Pete said, pointing. "Yes," Rosie said, "but I don't know where it ends. Mr. Thornton said far." Pete nodded. "Far's about right. Goes up to the ridge line." He turned the map. "Your scale's off here, but you've got the main buildings right." Rosie took the map back and studied it. "What does scale mean?" "Means the distances between things. Your barn and house look the right distance apart, but the barn to the fence is too short. The fence is farther away than that in real life." Rosie looked at the map, then at him, then began carefully adjusting. Pete watched her make the correction with an expression Evelyn recognized. The expression adults got when a child surprised them by actually taking information in. "She'd been drawing long?" he asked Evelyn quietly. "Since she could hold a pencil." He nodded. "Smart kid." "I know," Evelyn said. In the afternoon, the three adults did a walk of the property, not planned exactly, more an extension of Pete's checking of fence lines. But Silas mentioned the well situation, and Pete walked with them to the water source and stood looking at it with his arms crossed and his hat pushed back. "That's down," Pete said. "Yes," Silas said. "More than last year." "More." Pete crouched and looked at the rock around the well's edge, touched it, pressed with 2 fingers in a way that seemed to mean something to him. He stood back up. "There's a property up in the Lassen Valley had this problem. Fellow there found water up the hill, where the rock faces north. Said there was a seep in the stone that fed down. He dug it out and ran a channel." "Did it work?" Evelyn asked. Pete tilted his head. "Worked for 2 years. Then the seep moved." He shrugged. "These things aren't permanent solutions. But 2 years is 2 years." Silas looked at the hillside above the well. "I've walked that ground." "Looking for what?" "I don't know. Green grass where it shouldn't be. Soft ground." "You'd know better than me," Pete said, "but I'd check the rock faces, too. Sometimes it's not on the surface." Evelyn was quiet through this exchange, looking up at the hillside. There were places where the rock broke through the soil, gray face, split in places. And she thought about what Silas had said to Rosie about springs in mountain rock, about water moving through and finding new ways. She thought about something else, too. Something she half remembered from a conversation with Martin years ago, but she couldn't get it clear enough to say out loud yet. She filed it and walked back down with the others. That night, after Pete had gone and Rosie was in bed, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the lamp on and did math on a piece of paper. She wrote down what she knew about the water table drop, the 6-week estimate, the cost of a new well, as Silas had described it. Then she wrote down what she knew about the ranch's income, roughly, from the conversations they'd had, from what she'd observed. She was not a woman who avoided looking at numbers because the numbers were frightening. She'd learned that looking at the numbers was the only way to change them. The numbers were not good. Not catastrophic, but not good. She heard Silas come in from outside, the door closing quiet, boots on the floor. He came through to the kitchen and stopped when he saw her at the table with the paper. "What are you doing?" he said. "Looking at what we're working with." He came and looked at the paper over her shoulder without touching it. She felt him register the numbers, the categories she'd made. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "You did this from what I've told you? And from what I can see, I'm probably off on some of it. The winter feed estimate is too low. I pay more than that." "How much more?" He told her. She corrected the number. The column got worse. "All right," she said, "so here's where we actually are." "Yeah." He looked at the paper. Here's where we actually are. The lumber cost this week. That takes another. She wrote it in. Here. He nodded. The drilling estimate you mentioned, if it came to that. She wrote it in the far column with a question mark. This is the version where everything goes wrong at once. That's not likely. No, but that's the ceiling. She looked at him. What's the floor? What's the version where the spring comes back on its own and you don't need to drill? He leaned back in his chair. Better. Not comfortable, but better. The eggs, she said. I got 45 cents a dozen from Margaret Purcell. How often have you been selling eggs? I haven't. I've been eating them. She looked at him. You have 43 laying hens. I know I have 43 laying hens. That's a significant quantity of eggs for one person and one dog. I know that too. So why haven't you been selling them? He rubbed the back of his neck. Because going to Millhaven takes a full day and I've been… He stopped. I've been not going to Millhaven. Because of what Margaret Purcell said. Because of generally not going to Millhaven, he said, a little stiffly. She looked at him for a moment. Let it sit. Well, she said, I'll go, twice a month. The eggs, and whatever other surplus we have. She wrote it down. That's not nothing. It's not enough. No, but it's a start at not making it worse. She put the pencil down. The preserve idea. He looked up. What preserve idea? I've been thinking about it. There's fruit on the east side of the property. Those wild plum trees near the lower fence. They went completely unharvested this fall. I don't have time to… Next fall, she said. Next season, if we're still here. She held his look when she said it, making it a real question. Are we planning on still being here next fall? The question sat between them. Silas looked at the paper with the numbers on it. Then he looked at her. I'm planning on being here, he said carefully. Then I'm planning on being here, she said. And next fall we harvest the plums and I'll put up preserves and we sell those too. She picked up the pencil again. It won't save the ranch, but it's the kind of thing that adds up. He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at Rosie, like something had happened that he hadn't seen coming and hadn't entirely processed yet. You've been here 10 days, he said. I know how long I've been here. You're planning a harvest for next fall. Someone has to. She wrote the preserves in the income column with another question mark. You don't have to decide anything tonight. I'm just showing you what I see. He was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. Outside, the wind was doing its mountain thing, and the lamp made its small, warm circle on the table and the numbers on the paper, and it was not a comfortable scene exactly. It was honest, which was different, and sometimes honesty looked cold from the outside, even when it was actually the warmest thing in the room. There's something I should tell you, Silas said. She waited. Callow, the man from Caldwell Creek. She put the pencil down. I know who he is, Silas said. Not personally, but I know the name. He's been trying to buy up land in this valley for 3 years. He's not interested in rooming houses. He met her eyes. He's a landman, Evelyn. He buys cheap and pushes people out. The rooming house was probably just a side operation, but if he's got people watching roads… He might know where I came from, she said. He might know you're here. The wind hit the north wall and the lamp flickered. Evelyn looked at the numbers on the paper and then at the man across the table and did the calculation she always did. The practical one, the one that didn't include feelings. And then she set it aside because some calculations required you to include what you couldn't quantify. Does that change anything? She asked. For you. He looked at her steadily. No, he said. It doesn't change anything. She picked up the pencil. Then we keep working. He reached across the table and tapped the paper, not touching her hand, just the corner of the paper. Add a line for the Southfield yield. I've been underplanting it. She added the line. They worked through the numbers until the lamp ran low, and when they were done, nothing was solved, but everything was seen, which was the best you could usually say about an honest accounting. Upstairs, Rosie slept with the dog at the foot of her bed and the book on the nightstand and her map folded carefully under it, and the mountain held them all inside its cold, indifferent dark, the way mountains have always held the small, warm things that try to survive inside them, without preference, without mercy, just with the plain fact of the walls. The letter came on a Tuesday, tucked between a seed catalog and a bill from the feed supply, and Silas almost didn't see it because it had no return address, and the handwriting on the front was the cramped, careful kind that people use when they're trying not to be recognized by their own hand. He brought it inside without opening it, set it on the table, and stood looking at it while he poured his coffee. Evelyn came in from outside, stomping mud off her boots, and saw his face before she saw the letter. "What is it?" He slid it toward her. She looked at the front. Her name, written in that careful, cramped hand, care of Thornton Ranch, which meant whoever sent it knew exactly where she was. She opened it. The letter was short, 4 lines. It said that a man named Callow had been asking around Caldwell Creek about a woman and a girl who'd gone north on the mountain road, and that whoever was hiding them would be smart to reconsider, and that the property Thornton was sitting on had a fair value and a willing buyer if things got difficult. It was not signed. Evelyn read it twice and put it down on the table. "Who sent this?" she said. "I don't know the hand." Silas turned his coffee cup. "But I know what it means. That's not a warning. That's an opener. He's making an offer through a threat. That's how Callow works, from what I've heard. He doesn't come himself. He sends letters. He sends deputies. He sends—" Silas stopped. "He makes people feel like leaving is their own idea." Evelyn sat down. She put both hands flat on the table the way she did when she was getting her thinking straight. "He wants the land. He's been after this valley for 3 years. I've had 2 other letters, different, more polite, actual offers with numbers. I didn't respond to either." She looked up. "You didn't tell me that. You'd been here a week when I found out about Callow." He held her look. "I didn't want to put more on you than what was already there." "That was the wrong call," she said. Not angry, just direct. "I know that now." She picked up the letter again, read the 4 lines a third time, as if she might find something different in them. She didn't. She set it down. "Does he have a legal claim to anything here?" "No." "Any relationship with the county surveyor? The land office?" Silas paused. "I don't know." "We need to know." She stood up. "Pete might know. He's been in this county longer than you." "Pete's been here since before the road went in." "Then let's ask Pete." Rosie came in from the chicken pen with 3 eggs in her coat pockets and mud on her knees, and Rotten's feathers, 1 brown one, stuck to her sleeve, and stopped in the doorway when she read the room. She looked at Evelyn, then at Silas, then at the letter on the table. "Something happened," she said. "Nothing you need to worry about," Evelyn said. Rosie looked at her mother with the patient, assessing expression of a child who has learned that nothing you need to worry about means something happened. "Is it the man from Caldwell Creek?" Silas looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at her daughter. "What do you know about a man from Caldwell Creek?" "You talked about him. When you thought I was sleeping." Rosie came in and put the eggs carefully on the counter, peeled the chicken feather off her sleeve, and set it down too. "I know there's a man who wanted you to leave and didn't want you to come here." She looked at them both. "Is he going to try to make Mr. Thornton sell?" Silas cleared his throat. "Where'd you get that?" "I heard you, the night with the numbers paper." She sat down at the table in her usual chair, folding her hands in her lap with a seriousness that made her look briefly like a very small banker. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know things," she said. "It makes everything take longer." Evelyn sat back down. She looked at her daughter, this child who had spent months learning to be invisible and was now, in the space of 3 weeks on a mountain ranch, apparently deciding to reverse that, and felt the complicated mixture of pride and sorrow and something that was mostly love. "He's trying to make things difficult," Evelyn said. "We're figuring out how to handle it." "Does Mr. Thornton want to sell?" "No," Silas said. "Does he have to?" "Not if I can help it." Rosie nodded, like a small committee member recording a position. "Okay," she said. "I'm going to feed the rest of the chickens." She got up and went back outside. Silas watched her go. "She is," he said slowly, "not a usual kind of child." "No," Evelyn agreed. "She's not." Pete came the following morning, and they sat him down at the kitchen table and put coffee in front of him, and Silas asked what he knew about Callow's operations in the county. Pete's expression didn't change, but he wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the table for a moment before he answered, which meant he was choosing words. "Callow's been buying in this valley since about '68, he said. "Started with the Elker place. Paid fair that time because Elker wanted out. Then the Morrison parcel, which was different. Morrison didn't want out, but he had a note at the Millhaven Bank, and Callow had a relationship with the bank." He paused. Then the Whitfield land, which was a water rights dispute that somehow got worse the longer it went on, and somehow got better the day after Whitfield signed the paper. He manufactured the dispute, Evelyn said. That's what people said. Nothing proved. Pete drank his coffee. He's not in the county land office directly, but he's got a man there, fellow named Gruder, who processes surveys. If a survey gets filed and Gruder's the one who handles it, things tend to go a certain way. What way? Silas said. Slow. Or wrong. Pete set his mug down. There was a rancher up in the North Quarter, Halverson, who tried to file a water rights claim 2 years back. Gruder processed it. Claim came back rejected on a boundary error that everyone who looked at it said wasn't an error. Halverson hired a lawyer from Red Fork, and the lawyer took one look and agreed, wasn't an error. But fighting it through the proper channels took 8 months, and by then Halverson was behind on his banknote, and Callow came in with an offer. Did Halverson sell? Evelyn asked. Halverson sold, Pete said. The kitchen was quiet. All right, Evelyn said. She pulled the letter across the table and put it in front of Pete. He read it. His face was still, but his jaw tightened once, at the line about the willing buyer. Opener, Pete said. That's what Silas said. He'll wait a few weeks. See if the first one moved anything. If it didn't, there'll be another one, maybe a visit. Pete folded the letter and handed it back. He doesn't like to spend energy if he doesn't have to. He'll try the easy versions first. What do we do? Silas said. Pete looked at him steadily. You got your deed? Filed and clear. Water rights documented? A pause. The wells on the original survey. The creek easements documented. Any other water on the property? Anything not in the original survey that you've been using? Silas thought. There's a seasonal pool on the East Quarter. I haven't filed anything on it because it's been dry 2 of the last 4 years. Didn't think it was worth filing. File it, Pete said. File everything. Before Gruder or anyone else gets the idea to file something on your behalf without your knowing. Can they do that? They can file a lot of things, Pete said. Whether it holds is another question. But making you fight it is the point. He stood up, picked up his hat. You need to get ahead of this. Not react to it. Get ahead. After Pete left, Evelyn walked the south fence line alone because she needed to move. She'd learned that thinking while standing still made things feel worse than thinking while her hands were doing something, and the south fence had 2 rails that needed attention, and the work gave her body something to be in charge of while her head sorted through the rest. Callow was methodical. That was the thing about methodical people. They were also, in some ways, predictable. He sent letters first, then visits, then manufactured difficulties, then waited for the bank to do his work. The bank was the lever. You took the bank out of the equation, and you took most of his power. She thought about the numbers she and Silas had gone through. She thought about what Pete had said about filing. She thought about the well, which was still dropping. She'd checked it herself 2 mornings ago, lowered the measuring line and brought it up with 18 inches less wet than the first time she'd measured, which was not the direction you wanted 18 inches to go. The well was the vulnerability Callow didn't know about yet. Or maybe did know about, if he had someone in the valley watching, and she thought he probably did. And either way, the well was the place where the ranch could be made to fail without anyone's fingerprints on the failure. A well that went dry was just a well that went dry. She set a rail and drove the nails and moved to the next section. The thing about water was that it didn't vanish. Pete had said it. Silas had said it. Even Martin had said something like it. She was getting closer to remembering what exactly, but the memory was still fragmentary. A voice without a complete sentence. Water moved. Water found its way through. The question was always where. She finished the south fence and walked back through the lower field and past the East Quarter where the seasonal pool sat dry under its ring of willow. She'd noticed the willows before but hadn't thought hard about them. Willows were water followers, she knew that. They didn't grow where there was nothing. But the pool had been dry 2 of 4 years, which argued against a reliable source nearby. Unless the source was reliable and the pool wasn't the source. She stood at the edge of the dry pool and looked at the willows and then up the slope behind them, where the rock broke through and long gray shelves angled toward the north. North-facing rock. Like Pete had said, the property in Lassen Valley, north-facing rock, a seep in the stone. She walked up the slope. The rock was cold under her hand when she put her palm flat against it, colder than the air, which was wrong. Rock held the temperature of whatever surrounded it, generally. Rock that was colder than the air meant something was moving through it that was colder than the surface. She crouched and looked at the base of the shelf, where soil met stone. Damp. Not wet, but not dry either. The particular darkness of soil that had moisture in it, despite weeks without rain. She stood up and looked down the slope at the willows and then back at the rock, and then up to where the shelf extended along the hillside. She couldn't prove anything from this. She was not a geologist or a well man or anything close, but she had looked at enough practical problems to know that the difference between a real thing and her imagination of a real thing was whether it made structural sense. This made structural sense. She went to find Silas. He was in the barn working on the harness when she came in, and he looked up at her face and put the harness down. "What did you find?" he said. "I don't know yet. Come look." He came. She walked him up the slope and showed him the rock and the damp soil at the base and explained the temperature. He crouched where she'd crouched, put his own hand against the rock, pressed his fingers into the soil. "I walked this slope," he said, looking at the surface. "I was looking at the base of the rock." He stood up slowly, looking at the shelf above them. "It extends all the way to the ridge." "I know. And if there's a seep feeding this, if the source is up high in the rock and moving down, the pool isn't the water," he said. "The pool is the overflow." Or it was, before whatever shifted the table shifted it. He was quiet for a moment, working through it. She watched him think and did not hurry him. "If the water moved inside the rock," he said slowly, "it might still be moving, just finding a new way out," she said. It was what he'd told Rosie. She watched him recognize his own words. He looked at the rock. "I'd need to dig along the base, see if there's an outlet lower down." "Yes." "If I'm wrong, I've dug a trench for nothing." "You've dug a trench for nothing," she agreed, "and we're no worse than we were." He pulled off his glove and put his bare hand against the rock, held it there. She watched him do it and thought that there was something in the gesture that was not purely practical, a man checking with his own skin whether to believe something, the way you had to sometimes, when the question was too important to trust to logic alone. "All right," he said, "I'll start digging. I'll help. You've got fence work." "The fence will wait." He looked at her. He didn't argue. They started the next morning. Pete came and the three of them worked the base of the rock shelf, Pete and Silas digging, Evelyn running the removed earth back from the face in the wheelbarrow so it didn't pile up and obstruct. The ground was hard, frozen in the top layer, and the digging was slow. Rosie stood at the bottom of the slope for part of the morning, watching with her arms crossed, and then went back to the house when Evelyn told her the second time that watching people dig was not the most useful way to spend a morning. By noon they had a trench 6 feet long and 2 feet deep along the base of the rock face and had found nothing except more cold rock and very slightly damp soil that got marginally damper as they went deeper. Pete straightened up and stretched his back. "Marginally damper is something." "It's not water," Silas said. "It's not no water either." Pete leaned on his shovel and looked at the sky, which was doing the thing winter skies did in the mountains, the whitening that meant something was coming, probably by nightfall. "We should stop before the weather hits, start again when it passes." Silas didn't look happy about stopping. "The rock's not going anywhere," Pete said, "and digging in a snowstorm is just a different kind of stupid." They stopped. The snow came in the afternoon, the serious kind, not the picturesque kind, driving and horizontal and full of intention. Silas moved the horses into the barn and added extra feed, and Evelyn went around the property checking that everything was secured, and by the time she came in, she was soaked through the back of her coat, and her hands had gone to the deep cold that took a long time to come back from. She came in the back door and stood at the stove for a full 5 minutes, not doing anything useful, just standing there getting the feeling back in her fingers. From the other room, she could hear Rosie's voice and Silas's, lower, the back-and-forth rhythm of a conversation she couldn't quite hear over the wind. When she could feel her hands again, she went through. Rosie was at the table with her map, which had grown considerably over the weeks. She was now on her 4th piece of brown paper, taped together at the edges, and it covered most of the table when unfolded. She had drawn in the trench they'd dug that day, labeled it Water Search in her careful print, and had added something new in the upper left corner of the map, up where the question mark used to be. Evelyn looked at it. "What's that?" "That's where the north fence ends," Rosie said. "Mr. Thornton told me. Finally." She glanced at Silas with mild reproach. I gave you a compass heading and a landmark, Silas said. That's specific. I had to estimate the distance. The distance is approximate. My estimates are good, Rosie said, and returned to her map. Evelyn sat down and looked at the map properly for the first time in a while. The girl had been updating it constantly, and what had started as a child's rough sketch was now something substantially more. The ranch buildings to scale, the fence lines measured by her own pacing, the water sources marked, the tree lines sketched in with small, careful marks. There were notes in the margins. Trouble, rotten likes south corner. Soft ground here, wet in morning. Rock breaks out here. Evelyn stopped. Rosie. She pointed at a note on the east slope near the upper quarter. This one. Soft ground and wet in morning. When did you write this? Rosie leaned over. Last week, when I was watching the sunrise from the east fence. The ground up there was soft even though it hadn't rained. Did you tell anyone? I wrote it on the map. Evelyn looked at Silas. He was looking at the map, at the note, at the location marker, above and to the left of where they'd been digging. That's higher up, he said. 200 feet maybe, Evelyn said, if her distance is right. My distance is right, Rosie said, with the mild certainty of someone who has just been told their estimates are not good and is providing a rebuttal. Silas stood up and went to the window, even though there was nothing to see through the snow. He stood there for a moment. Evelyn watched his shoulders and saw the thing that happened in them when he was recalculating. A subtle shift, like a man adjusting the weight he's carrying. We've been digging at the base, he said. If the seep is higher, the water moves down inside the rock, Evelyn said. It's not coming out at the base because there's nowhere for it to come out. There might be a fracture higher up. He turned from the window. If there's a fracture at that elevation and we open it, the water follows the grade down, past the east quarter, to the well. She wasn't certain of this. She wasn't a geologist and she didn't know for sure and she wanted to be honest about that. Or somewhere near it. That's a significant if, Silas said. I know. And if we open a fracture that turns out to be a small seep and not a real source, we've done some digging, she said. Same answer as before. He looked at his daughter, at the map, then at Evelyn. When the snow stops, he said. The snow took 2 days. On the second day, in the afternoon, Evelyn went through the farm accounts properly for the first time. Silas gave her the box of receipts and ledgers without her asking twice, which she took as a measure of something, and she went through it systematically at the kitchen table while the snow came down outside and Rosie read her book and Silas worked in the barn. The picture that emerged from the accounts was not as bad as the worst version she'd imagined, and not as good as the version that let everyone sleep easily. The ranch was functional, productive in the seasons when the water was right, capable of improving with consistent attention. The years since Clara had died were visible in the ledger in a particular way. Not disaster, but drift. Things not maintained, income streams not pursued, small inefficiencies that accumulated the way small debts did. Not individually ruinous, but collectively wearing. She wrote her own set of notes in the margin of a clean page. Not instructions. She was careful about that because this was his ranch and his livelihood, and she was here by arrangement, not by ownership. But observations, the kind that said, here's what I see, here's what it might look like if. When Silas came in from the barn, stamping snow from his boots, she was still at the table. He poured himself coffee, looked at the ledger spread across the surface, looked at the pages she'd written. I didn't say you could look at the accounts, he said. I know. She looked at him steadily. Do you want me to stop? He sat down. He pulled her notes toward him and read them without expression. She watched his face and couldn't tell what he was thinking, which was more unusual now than it had been at the beginning. She'd gotten better at reading him, so when she couldn't, it meant he was holding something close. The south field, he said finally. You think it could support another crop? If the water situation resolves. Not before. She'd been careful to tie every observation back to the water because without water the rest of it was theoretical. But if it resolves, the south field is underproducing by about a third based on what I can see. I've been putting the second planting in the east quarter. The east quarter's soil is thinner. You'd get more from the south even with the same seed weight. He was quiet. How do you know that? My husband farmed for 6 years before he went to the mines, she said. I helped. She paused. I wasn't just watching. He turned the page with her notes on it. He didn't say anything for a while. Then, Clara used to say I ran the ranch like a man who planned to leave. Evelyn hadn't expected that. Did you plan to leave? No? He turned the page back. But after she died, I stopped planning to stay. That's different, but it comes out the same way in the ledger. She looked at the ledger. At the years of drift written in the numbers. You didn't leave, though. No. You stayed and you kept it going. Barely. Barely's not nothing, she said. Barely means you're still here. He looked at her. Something in his face. Not the door opening all the way, but more than an inch this time. A crack of actual light. You sound like Cutler, he said. The man with the side of beef. Was he right? He wasn't wrong. She closed the ledger. When the snow stops, we dig higher up the slope, and then we figure out the rest after. The snow stopped on the morning of the third day. By mid-morning, the sky was the high, clear blue that came after serious mountain snow, and the ground lay white and unmarked all the way to the tree line. Silas and Pete were up the slope by noon, and Evelyn was with them. They dug where Rosie's map put the soft ground, 200 feet above and east of the original trench, at a place where the rock face angled sharply and created a kind of shelf. The ground here was harder on top from the freeze, but when they broke through the surface layer, the soil below was dark and held together in a way that dry soil didn't. Pete crouched and pressed both hands into it. He looked up at Silas. That's wet, he said. Not damp. Wet. Silas drove the shovel in deeper. The soil came up dark and heavy, and when he dropped a handful of it, it held together in a clump rather than falling apart. He drove the shovel in again, and this time when he pulled it back, a trickle of water followed the blade out, ran down the blade, dripped from the tip. They all looked at it. That's not a surface seep, Pete said, quiet. He stood up. That's pressure from below. Silas said nothing. He drove the shovel in a third time, angled differently, and when he worked the blade loose, the trickle became a small but definite flow. Water moving out of the earth with its own momentum, not just seeping, but pushing, looking for the opening. Dig wider, Pete said. They dug wider. By the time an hour had passed, they had opened a section 3 feet across, and the flow had increased to something that moved with real intention, cutting a channel down through the disturbed soil. It was not a river. It was not even close to what the well needed at its best, but it was moving, cold and clean and persistent, from somewhere inside the mountain that had been looking for a way out. Pete sat back on his heels and looked at it. I'll be damned, he said. Silas had his hand in the flow. He didn't say anything. His face had something on it that Evelyn couldn't name and didn't try to, because some things didn't need naming out loud. They were still working out how to channel it when Evelyn looked down the slope and saw Rosie at the bottom, standing with her hands in her coat pockets, and Bishop beside her, both of them looking up. She's supposed to be in the house, Silas said. She's not in the house, Evelyn said. I can see that. Evelyn cupped her hands. Rosie! The sound traveled clean in the cold air. Rosie looked up. Even at that distance, Evelyn could see that she already knew. She'd known from the way the three adults moved, or from Bishop reading it off them, or because she was the kind of child who paid attention in the specific way that looked like stillness, but was actually the opposite. Is it there? Rosie called up. Evelyn looked at the water moving out of the open ground, at Pete's hand still submerged in the flow, at Silas, who still had his palm flat against the cold current. It's there, she called back. Rosie stood with her hands in her pockets and looked up at them for a moment. She didn't cheer or wave or do anything demonstrative. She just nodded, once, the way someone nods when a thing they were fairly sure about turns out to be confirmed. Then she turned and started back toward the house, and Bishop followed her, and the tracks they left in the snow were small and even, leading back through the white to the warm yellow square of the kitchen window. Silas watched her go. He still had his hand in the water. She marked it on her map, he said. A week ago. She noticed soft ground, Evelyn said. She noticed it and wrote it down. She's been writing everything down. He took his hand out of the water and looked at it, cold and clean, water running off the lines of his palm. I walked that slope 3 times, he said. I didn't see it. You were looking for wet ground, Evelyn said. She wasn't looking for anything. She was just paying attention. He wiped his hand on his jacket and looked down at the ranch below them. The house, the barn, the paddock with the horses, the chicken pen where Rotten and her reluctantly coexisting associates were doing whatever chickens did in fresh snow: the white fields, the line of the south fence, the smoke from the chimney going straight up in the still cold air. "We'll need to channel it," Pete said. "Line trench down the slope. Connect it to the existing water system at the bottom." He was already practical, already in the next problem, which was Pete's way. "Take some work." "I know it," Silas said, "but it's workable." "Yeah," a pause. "It's workable." The three of them stood at the opening in the rock and let the water run. Below them, the ranch sat in its snow, small and imperfect, and still there. And the water came out of the mountain, the way things that have been waiting long enough always eventually do, not with any drama, just with the plain determined fact of its own movement. That evening, at dinner, Rosie put a careful new mark on her map. She drew a line from the upper east slope down toward the well, and she labeled it with an arrow and the word water in her small print, and she drew it as if it were already done, already flowing, already real, which it was not yet, but which she seemed to have decided was close enough to real to put on the map. Silas watched her draw it from across the table. He didn't say anything about it. He just passed her the bread when she reached for it, and she took it and said thank you without looking up. And Evelyn sat between them and listened to the wind doing its thing against the walls and thought about all the things that were still unresolved. Callow, the channel that hadn't been built yet, the winter that had several weeks left in it, the question of what spring would actually look like when it came. There was still plenty that could go wrong. There was still the letter on the counter, still Gruder in the land office, still the bank that Callow had relationships with. The water in the rock didn't fix any of that. But it was there, moving, looking for its way out. And downstairs, tacked to the kitchen wall where anyone could see it, Rosie's map showed every inch of this mountain ranch in careful, accumulated detail. The fences and the fields, the buildings and the trees, the dry pool under its willows, the soft ground above the east quarter, and now the water line running down from where a child had written her small observant note the week before and thought nothing more of it, because to Rosie it had simply been a thing she noticed and wrote down, which is all that paying attention ever really is. The channel took 11 days to build. Pete designed it and Silas dug most of it, and Evelyn did the lining work, packed clay from the low field mixed with gravel, tamped in sections, which was slow and hard on the hands but held water better than loose earth and cost nothing beyond the labor. They worked in sections from the top down, and every morning Evelyn checked the previous day's work for settling or cracking before they moved forward. She'd learned that from Martin too, who had said that the only thing worse than building something wrong was not checking it soon enough to fix it cheaply. Rosie was not permitted to help with the digging, a ruling she contested formally at breakfast on the third day by presenting her case to both adults simultaneously. She could carry the gravel, she was strong enough, she would stay away from the open trench, and was overruled by 2 votes to 1, with Bishop abstaining. She accepted the verdict with the particular dignity of a child who has said her piece and knows when further argument is counterproductive, and she went back to her map and added the channel to it in pencil, section by section, as they completed each one. On the 4th day, a rider came to the gate. Evelyn saw him first from the south field where she was measuring clay. He sat on a bay horse at the gate without opening it, just sitting, looking at the ranch, and she watched him for a moment before she went to find Silas. "Rider at the gate," she said. Silas was in the trench. He climbed out and looked down the slope. The rider was still there, still just sitting. "I don't know the horse," Silas said. "Neither do I." She paused. "He's not getting down." Staying mounted at someone's gate was a particular kind of message. It said, "I'm not here to be friendly, and I want you to know that before we say a word." Silas went down the slope. Evelyn stayed where she was for a moment, then followed at a distance that was close enough to hear and far enough to leave him room. She'd found this was often the right position with Silas, close enough to be useful, far enough not to crowd him. The rider was a young man, mid-20s, with the pressed look of someone who worked for someone else, and dressed to prove it. He had a leather case across his saddle. "Thornton?" he said. "That's me. I have a document from Mr. Callow's office." He opened the leather case and produced an envelope, heavy paper, sealed with wax, the kind of envelope that wanted to look more official than it was. "He asks that you give it consideration." Silas took the envelope without opening it. "Tell him I'll do that." The rider waited, as if expecting the envelope to be opened in front of him. When it wasn't, he looked uncertain. He hoped for a response. He'll get one, Silas said, when I'm ready. Another pause. The writer looked past Silas at Evelyn, then back at Silas. Mr. Callow is aware that your water situation has become complicated, he said, carefully. He wanted you to know that his offer takes the current circumstances into account. Silas said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was level and quiet. You rode 12 miles to deliver a letter and a threat. It's not a threat, sir. It's an offer. The mention of my water situation is a threat, Silas said. The offer is just the paper around it. He took one step back from the gate. You can go now. The rider hesitated, then turned his horse and rode back down the mountain road. They watched him go. Evelyn came up beside Silas. He still hadn't opened the envelope. He knows about the well, she said. He's been watching. Or someone in Mill Haven told him. When we bought the lumber, I mentioned the repair work to Margaret Purcell. Silas turned the envelope in his hands. It wasn't your fault. I know, but it's how he knows. She looked at the road where the rider had gone. He doesn't know about the spring yet. He knows about the well going down, but not that we found water above. He'll know eventually. Eventually is different from now. She looked at him. Open it. He opened it. The letter inside was 3 paragraphs, formal, measured, almost courteous in its language. It offered him a sum for the ranch that was roughly 60% of what the land would fetch in a fair market. It noted, in the second paragraph, that ranches facing water scarcity tended to see declining valuations, and that the offer reflected present circumstances rather than hypothetical futures. The third paragraph mentioned, almost as an aside, that certain boundary questions on the property's north quarter had come to the attention of the county surveyor's office and might warrant clarification. That was the one that mattered. Evelyn read it twice. There's no boundary question on the north quarter, Silas said. His voice had gone flat in the way it did when he was controlling something underneath. There isn't now, Evelyn said. But Gruder can make one. That's the point. It doesn't have to be real. It just has to take long enough to fight that the bank gets impatient. She looked at the letter again. The third paragraph had a careful quality to it. Not quite a statement, not quite a question, just a mention. The kind of language that a lawyer had written to be deniable. Pete said to get ahead of it, she said. We need someone to look at the north boundary before Gruder touches it. A surveyor who isn't Gruder. The county surveyor is Gruder. The county surveyor is Gruder, she agreed. Who is the nearest independent surveyor, Silas thought. There's a man named Ackerman in Red Fork. He does private work. Halverson used a lawyer from Red Fork, Evelyn said, remembering Pete's account from weeks earlier. If Ackerman knows the lawyer, if they've worked together on exactly this kind of situation, they probably have, Silas said slowly. Then we go to Red Fork. He looked at her. That's 2 days each way. I know what it is. The channel's not finished. Pete can keep the channel moving for 4 days. He knows what the next sections need. She folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. If we wait for a better time, there won't be a better time. That's how this works. You wait for better, and he manufactures worse. Silas stood at the gate where the rider had been, looking down the mountain road. The cold had come back in the last few days, a deeper cold that smelled like more snow. He turned the empty wax-sealed envelope in his hand and looked at it like a man looking at a thing he'd been hoping not to have to deal with. 4 days, he said. 4 days. Rosie stays with Pete. Evelyn considered whether Rosie would accept this arrangement and decided she would, if it was presented as Pete needing help with the ranch rather than Rosie needing supervision. I'll explain it to her tonight. Silas looked back at the house. She'll argue. She'll negotiate, Evelyn said. There's a difference. She'll want something in exchange. What? Probably naming rights over whatever animal is born or arrives while we're gone. Silas was quiet for a moment. There's a rabbit in the east barn that looks like it's about to produce, he said. Then we'll have several interestingly named rabbits when we get back. He almost smiled. Not quite. His face still held back from the full version, but close enough that she noticed, and filed it, and didn't say anything about it. She told Rosie at dinner. She framed it as Pete needing a capable pair of hands on the ranch while they were away on business, which was true enough. Rosie listened, looked at Pete, who had come for the evening meal, and then looked at Evelyn. How many days? Rosie said. 4, maybe 5. What business? Ranch business, the kind that needs to be handled in person. Rosie looked at Silas. Is it about the man from Caldwell Creek? A pause around the table. Some of it, Silas said. Rosie absorbed this. She turned to Pete. The rabbit in the east barn is going to have babies, she said. Pete looked at her. How do you know about the rabbit? I know about everything on this ranch, Rosie said without arrogance, just as a statement of fact. Can I name the babies? Pete looked at Silas, who looked at Evelyn, who looked back at Silas with the expression she'd predicted having. Yes, Silas said. All of them? All of them, Rosie nodded. Okay, she said, and went back to her dinner. They left before first light 2 days later. Pete arrived the night before and slept in the bunk room, and in the morning he had the stove going by the time Evelyn came through, which she appreciated without saying so. Rosie was up. She'd been awake when Evelyn checked on her in the night, lying with her eyes open in the dark, though she pretended to be asleep, and she stood in the yard in her coat in the cold blue pre-dawn and watched them get the wagon ready. You'll be careful, she said to Evelyn, not as a question. We'll be careful. And you'll come back in 4 days? 4 days, 5 at most. Rosie looked at Silas. You'll make sure? I'll make sure, he said. She nodded. She looked at both of them standing by the wagon in the early dark, and something moved across her face, a flicker of something that was not quite fear and not quite worry, but some version of both that a 7-year-old carries when the people she has come to depend on are about to be somewhere she can't see them. She straightened up and stepped back toward Pete. Okay, she said. Go. They went. The road to Red Fork ran east and south, dropping out of the mountain country into lower valley land that felt a different temperature entirely, warmer, more open, less protected. Evelyn had not been this direction before. She sat on the wagon seat beside Silas and watched the country change and thought about what they needed to accomplish and in what order. Tell me about Ackerman, she said, an hour into the road. I've never used him. I know his name from Pete and from Halverson's situation. He adjusted the reins. He's supposed to be thorough. Doesn't move fast, but he gets it right. Can we afford thorough? We can't afford fast and wrong. She thought about the letter's third paragraph, the mention of the north boundary, which was the loaded item, the thing that would move first if Callow wanted to force action. If Ackerman surveys the north boundary before Gruder files anything, does that protect us? Depends on what Ackerman finds and how it's filed. Can we file the survey with someone other than Gruder? Silas was quiet for a moment. I don't know who else has authority. The lawyer might know. If there's a Red Fork lawyer who's fought Gruder's work before, he'll know the alternate routes. She paused. We need both, the surveyor and the lawyer, in that order, or together. You think like a general, Silas said. I think like someone who's been outmaneuvered before, she said. It's not the same thing. A general goes looking for the fight. I'm just trying not to lose ground. He looked at the road ahead. I didn't mean it as a criticism. I know. They drove in silence for a while. The valley opened and the sky got bigger and the cold was the clear, dry kind rather than the wet mountain kind. Evelyn pulled her coat tighter. The well, she said after a while. When the channel's done, how long before we know if it's actually raising the water level? Pete thinks a week after the channel's fully open, maybe 2. And if it doesn't? Then we're where we were, except with a channel. With a channel and more time, she said. The channel being there means the water's moving. Even if the well doesn't respond immediately, the water table in the east quarter should improve. That's good for the south field planting. You're already planting the south field. I've been planting the south field for 3 weeks. He looked at her sidelong. You do that. You plan things before they're settled. Does that bother you? He thought about it honestly. It used to bother me when Clara did it, he said. She'd talk about a thing as if it were decided when I was still thinking it through. I felt not consulted. He paused. But you don't do it the same way. You plan, and then you show it to me. It's different. It's not really planning, she said. It's just not turning away from what could be. He was quiet, and she didn't try to explain it further, because it was one of those things that either landed or didn't. Red Fork was a larger town than Mill Haven, a proper county seat with a courthouse and 3 law offices, and a hotel that had a sign in the window about dining hours. They arrived late afternoon on the second day and found a rooming house, 2 separate rooms, which she had insisted on and he had not argued with. and ate in the hotel dining room because the rooming house didn't offer food. It was the first time they'd sat across a table in a public place, and Evelyn was aware of it in the way you're aware of things that are slightly outside your normal frame. People looked, not rudely, but they looked, and she was conscious of what they saw. A man and a woman, unmarried by obvious signs, sitting together over a meal in a county seat 40 miles from their ranch. She was aware of how it read, and aware that she didn't particularly care, which surprised her, because 6 months ago she'd cared very much about how things looked and what people's interpretations meant for her ability to move through the world safely. She ordered the beef stew. Silas ordered the same. They talked about Ackerman's office, which Pete had directed them to on a street near the courthouse, and about the lawyer's office beside it, and whether they should see Ackerman first or the lawyer. Ackerman first, she said. We need to know what the survey can actually deliver before we ask the lawyer what to do with it. Agreed. And we need to ask Ackerman specifically about the North Quarter boundary. The original survey markers. Are they still there? 2 of them for certain. I passed them last fall. Then we start there. She broke a piece of bread. How does Ackerman bill? I don't know. We should know before we sit down with him. Silas looked at her across the table. Do you always prepare this thoroughly? I prepare until I'm not surprised in the room, she said. Being surprised in the room is expensive. He ate his stew. She ate hers. Outside the window, Red Fork went about its evening business. A man delivering something on a handcart, 2 women in good coats walking together, a kid chasing a dog between the buildings. Normal town evening. Evelyn watched it and thought about Rosie, who was 4 days' distance in both directions, and who was probably at this moment sitting next to Pete near the stove while the ranch settled into its nighttime sounds. She thought about the rabbit in the east barn and the names Rosie was probably composing in her head, and the thought made something in her chest loosen slightly. She was afraid this morning, Evelyn said. Rosie, when we left. I know. She didn't show it. I know that too. Silas set his fork down. She reminds me of... He stopped. Evelyn waited. My daughter would have been about her age, he said. She died with Clara, the birth. He said it flat and direct, the way you say things that you have learned to say without letting them take you under every time. I don't bring it up because it's not something I put on people. Evelyn set her own fork down. Rosie is not her, he said quickly. I know that. I'm not confusing things. I know you're not, Evelyn said. But she has a way of noticing things. The way she mapped the ranch. The way she talks. Straight through to what she means without wasting words. He picked up his fork again and set it back down. I'm not explaining it well. You're explaining it fine. He looked at his plate. I should have told you that sooner. Before... He stopped. Before what? He looked at her across the table. Before it was already the case that it mattered to me. She held his look. He didn't look away, and neither did she, and the dining room did its evening business around them, and she thought about what he'd just said, and what it meant, and what she was going to do with it. Thank you for telling me, she said finally. That was all she said, and it was enough for the moment, because some things needed sitting with before you built anything on them. They found Ackerman the following morning, a compact, precise man who wore his profession in his posture, straight-backed and measured in the way of men who spend their working lives checking the accuracy of things. He listened to Silas explain the situation without interrupting, asked 3 specific questions about the original survey date and the marker locations and the nature of the North Quarter's terrain, and then opened a drawer and produced a copy of the original county survey of the property. He turned it to face them across the desk. This is Gruder's version, he said. Filed 64. I pull these when I get involved with a callow matter because it helps me understand what I'm walking into. He tapped a line on the survey map. This boundary here, the North Quarter East line, it's drawn from a reference point that I know to be a rock formation that has since been significantly altered by erosion. Silas leaned forward. Altered how? The top portion collapsed sometime in the late 60s. Which means if Gruder files a claim based on the original reference point description, and someone goes to check it against the physical landmark, the landmark no longer matches the description. Ackerman paused. That's not Gruder's fault. Things erode. But it creates a situation where a bad faith actor could argue the boundary is unclear. Because the reference point is gone, Evelyn said, or changed enough to dispute. Ackerman looked at her. If we resurvey now, using current methodology and multiple reference points that can't be disputed, we close that gap permanently. Whatever Gruder files afterward, you'll have a more recent and more thorough survey on record. Can it be filed with someone other than Gruder? Evelyn asked. Ackerman looked at her for a moment, taking her measure in the way professional men sometimes did when a woman asked a precise practical question in their office. The county surveyor has to countersign, he said, but it can be filed as a private survey and submitted through the courthouse clerk rather than through Gruder's office directly. He paused. Gruder will see it, but he won't touch it first. That's what we need, Evelyn said. There's a lawyer named Schaefer across the street, Ackerman said. He knows this terrain, the legal side of it. I'd say see him before you leave Red Fork. We plan to, Evelyn said. Ackerman looked at Silas. You want the survey done? Yes, Silas said. I can be on your property within the week. I'll need 3 days to work it properly. He named a figure. It was significant but not impossible, and Evelyn did the math in her head against what they had and what the spring might mean for spring planting income, and it landed in the range of difficult but survivable. Silas looked at her. She gave him one small nod. Do it, Silas said. Schaefer's office smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper and turned out to be run by a man in his 60s who had the comfortable directness of someone who had long ago stopped trying to seem more important than he was. He heard the Callow situation in about 10 minutes and then talked for 20, covering the county land office, Gruder's known history, Halverson's case, and 2 others Evelyn hadn't known about, and the specific legal steps that had worked and the ones that hadn't. The boundary survey is the right first move, he said. What you want after that is documentation of the water source, the spring you found. We haven't filed anything on it, Silas said. You need to. If Callow's people know about the well problem, and they do, if they sent a writer, they may not know about the spring yet, but they'll find out. And a water source on your property that isn't formally documented is a target. He leaned forward. You need a water rights claim filed on that spring before anyone else has the idea to file one against you. Gruder again, Silas said. Gruder for the county portion. But there's a state water authority that supersedes the county for new source filings. I can walk you through the state filing. He pulled a form from a drawer. It takes longer to process, but Gruder can't touch it. He looked at them both. You're in a better position than Halverson was. You have the water. You have the land. You have time, barely. The question is whether you move fast enough. We're moving, Evelyn said. He looked at her the way Ackerman had looked at her, measuring. Thornton, where'd you find this woman? Silas looked at Evelyn. There was something in his face, something that had been building for weeks and was getting less careful about showing itself. She found me, he said. I just had the sense to open the door. They were back on the mountain road by the 3rd evening, a day ahead of schedule because Schaefer had filed the water rights paperwork before they left, and Ackerman had confirmed his arrival date, and the thing that needed doing in Red Fork was done. Evelyn sat on the wagon seat in the dark with the cold at her back and the horse's breath making clouds in the lamplight, and she was tired in the clean way, the kind of tired that comes from doing the work, and not from worrying about whether it's being done. You should sleep, Silas said. I'm all right. You've been awake since 4. So have you. He said nothing to that because it was true. They drove. The mountain road climbed and the air got colder and sharper, and the stars came out in the way they only did at elevation, too many and too close, so many that the sky looked crowded. When we get back, Evelyn said, the channel should be close to done. Pete said he'd have the bottom section by the end of today. If the weather held. If the weather held. She thought about the water moving in the rock above the east quarter, finding its new way through. She thought about the survey markers on the north boundary that would now be documented properly, the way they should have been years ago. She thought about Schaefer's form, filed at the state level, with her name and Silas's name both on it because she'd suggested it, and Silas had said yes without hesitation. I put my name on that state filing, she said. You did. You didn't ask why. I didn't need to. She looked at the road ahead. It makes the filing stronger. 2 parties on a water claim are harder to challenge than one. She paused. But it also means I'm on a legal document connected to this ranch. I know what it means, he said, and you're all right with that. I suggested it, he said. She turned to look at him. He was watching the road, his hands easy on the reins, his profile lit faintly by the wagon lamp. "You told Schaefer to put both names," she said. "You were going to say it yourself." "I was thinking about saying it." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "You think a long time before you say things. Usually by the time you say them, they're already thought through from 6 directions." He kept his eyes on the road. "I've gotten to the point where I pay attention to what you're thinking toward, not just what you've finished thinking." Evelyn looked forward again, at the road and the dark, and the horse's ears against the lamplight. She didn't say anything for a while. Then, "I'm thinking toward staying." He drove. The wagon rocked gently over the mountain road. The horse's breath made its steady clouds in the cold. "I know," he said. They came back to the ranch in the early morning of the 4th day, just as Pete had the stove going and the first light was making the snow on the ridge turn pink. The wagon came through the gate, and Rosie was out of the house before they had the horse stopped. Appeared in the doorway in her coat thrown over her nightclothes, her hair loose, her feet in unlaced boots, and she crossed the yard at a pace that was almost a run, but held itself to a walk by apparent force of will. She stopped at the wagon while Silas was climbing down. She looked at both of them, doing the rapid systematic check that Evelyn recognized, making sure they were there, intact, returned as promised. 4 days, she said. 4 days, Evelyn confirmed. Rosie looked at Silas. I said I'd make sure, he said. She nodded. Then she said, the rabbits were born, 7 of them. I named them. What did you name them? Silas said. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket and read from a list, which meant she had prepared for this moment. Biscuit, Rue, Cinder, Patch, Thistle, Mud, and the small one, she paused. I named him Cutler. Silas went still. Evelyn looked at him. Cutler? He said. It's a good name, Rosie said, for the small one who might be stronger than he looks. She folded the list and put it back in her pocket, as if the matter were settled. Silas looked at the folded paper in her pocket, then at Evelyn, then back at Rosie. Something moved across his face that he didn't catch in time. Cutler's a good name, he said. His voice was steady, but only just. Pete appeared in the barn doorway. Channel's done, he said, to no one in particular. Bottom section went in yesterday afternoon. Water's running. They all turned. Through the quiet morning air, if you listened past the wind and the horse and the ordinary sounds of a working ranch starting its day, you could just barely hear it. Water, moving through rock and packed clay and gravel, finding the way that had been opened for it, running steady and cold and present toward the place it was needed. Rosie heard it first. She turned her head to the east, exactly the right direction, and listened with the same focused stillness she'd had since the beginning, the quality of attention that looked like quiet but was the opposite. And her face did something that Evelyn had not seen it do in a very long time. Not a careful smile, not a polite one. The other kind. The one that happened before a child thought about whether it was appropriate. It's running, Rosie said. It's running, Evelyn said. Rosie turned and walked back toward the house. I'm going to put it on the map, she said over her shoulder, with the date. Pete went back into the barn. Silas stood at the wagon with his hand still on the harness he'd been unhitching, and he was looking at the east slope where the channel ran down through the snow, and his face had the expression it got when it was holding something that it didn't yet have a name for. Evelyn stood beside him, not close enough to be anything in particular, just beside him in the cold morning, listening to the water that a child had found by writing down what she noticed. The survey's coming next week, she said. I know. And Schaefer said the state filing will process in 6 to 8 weeks. I know. It's not finished, she said. Callow's not done. No. He looked at the slope, at the waterline Rosie had drawn on the map weeks before it existed. But we're not either. The morning light came over the ridge and hit the snow, and the ranch came into its day, the horses stirring in the barn, the chickens starting their noise in the pen, the smoke from the kitchen stove rising straight in the still air. And none of it was settled, and most of it was still hard, and the water in the channel was a beginning, not an ending. But it ran. Ackerman arrived on a Monday with 2 assistants and a mule carrying his equipment, and he worked the north boundary for 3 full days without stopping for anything except coffee and a midday meal that Evelyn brought out to wherever they were on the property. He was methodical in the way she'd expected from their meeting in Red Fork, checking each point twice, documenting everything in a leather-bound field book, asking Silas specific questions about the history of the fence lines and whether any neighbor had ever contested the markers. On the third day, he came to the kitchen table and spread his preliminary findings out and walked them through it section by section. The north boundary was clean. The original markers, where they still existed, matched the survey description within acceptable tolerance. The eroded rock formation was documented, photographed with his field camera, and replaced as a reference point by 3 new markers that Ackerman had set himself in concrete and recorded by compass and chain measurement from 2 independent points. "Gruder can't touch this," he said, "not without being visibly wrong, and being visibly wrong in front of a state filing creates liability for him personally." "Will that stop him?" Silas asked. "It'll make him think harder about the cost," Ackerman said. "Men like Gruder don't have principles. They have calculations. You just changed his calculation." After Ackerman left, Silas walked the north boundary alone. He was gone most of the afternoon. Evelyn didn't ask where he'd been when he came back. She could see it in the way he moved, a kind of deliberate settling, a man who needed to stand on his own ground and feel that it was still his. She understood that. She'd needed the same thing, in different forms, enough times to recognize it. The well began responding 2 weeks after the channel opened. It was Rosie who noticed first, because Rosie checked the well every morning with the measuring line as if it were a personal responsibility she'd assigned herself. And she came in one Tuesday with her coat still on and the line still in her hand and announced, without ceremony, that the level was up 4 inches from the previous week. Pete, who was at the table with his coffee, looked up. 4 inches. 4.5, Rosie said. I measured twice. Silas looked at Evelyn across the table. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything, because saying something would have required knowing what to say, and neither of them had that quite yet. Pete drank his coffee. "Spring source is feeding the table," he said. "Takes time to move through the rock, but it moves." He set the cup down. "You'll want to measure every week. Document it. If Callow tries to make a water rights argument, you want a record showing the level rising from your documented source." "I've been keeping the measurements," Rosie said, from where she was hanging the line back on its hook. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket. She seemed to produce folded papers the way other people produced opinions, steadily and in quantity. "I started the day after we got back from Red Fork. I have 14 measurements." Pete looked at the paper she held out. He looked at the dates, the numbers, the small, careful notation at the bottom that said, "Source, Spring, East Quarter, Channel Opened, Date." He handed it back. "Keep doing that," he said. "I am," she said, as if the alternative had not occurred to her. Callow's second letter came 11 days after Ackerman finished his survey, and it was different from the first in the way that told you the first one hadn't worked. It was shorter, the courteous language mostly gone, and it mentioned specifically that a boundary irregularity had been identified by the county surveyor's office and would require formal review. There was a number for the ranch in the second paragraph, lower than the first offer. The third paragraph mentioned the bank. Silas read it at the kitchen table and set it down without expression and went outside. Evelyn heard the barn door open and close. She left him alone for 20 minutes and then took him coffee. He was standing in the center of the barn with his hands in his pockets and the coffee she'd sent out an hour ago, already cold, sitting on the workbench untouched. He took the new cup without comment. "The boundary review," he said. "Gruder." "Yes." She leaned against the stall door. "But Ackerman's survey is already filed at the state level. Schaefer told us. Gruder can open a review, but he can't make it stick against a documented state survey. The review process takes time and costs us some, but doesn't threaten the land. The bank mention is a threat designed to make us anxious." She looked at him steadily. "What's your actual position with the bank?" "Current. I've been current since you started selling the eggs." She had tripled the egg sales in 6 weeks by going to Millhaven twice a month instead of never, and had added preserves from the last of the fall fruit, and had negotiated a standing arrangement with Margaret Purcell that guaranteed purchase at a fixed price per dozen. It wasn't dramatic money, but it was consistent, and consistent money said different things to banks than irregular money did. "Then the bank threat is a bluff," she said. "He can't use the bank against you if you're current and your land title is clean. He might find another way to make the bank nervous. He might." She didn't minimize it, because minimizing real threats was how you got caught by them. "But Schaefer knows the bank's board. He told us. If Callow approaches them, Schaefer approaches them too, with the survey and the water rights filing and the payment history. She paused. We have more pieces on the board than we did 6 weeks ago, Silas. We're not where we were. He drank the coffee. He looked at the horses in their stalls, 7 of them, all well fed and wintered through better than last year, because there was water now and feed bought before prices rose. He's not going to stop, he said. No, she said. Probably not for a while. So how does this end? She thought about it, genuinely, not just to give him an answer. One of 2 ways, she said. He moves on to a softer target, which happens when the cost of this fight exceeds what the land is worth to him. Or he escalates past the point where our documentation can hold him. She paused. We make the first one happen by making ourselves expensive to pursue. More filings, more documentation, Schaefer visible and active. We prevent the second one by staying ahead of him. And if we can't stay ahead? We cross that when we reach it, she said. Right now we're ahead. He looked at her. You're not afraid. I'm afraid, she said. I'm just not letting it make the decisions. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want to write back to him. She looked at him. To Callow. Not to negotiate. Not to accept anything. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I want him to know that the survey is filed, that the water rights are filed, that we have a lawyer. I want him to know that we're not sitting here waiting. Schaefer said, I know what Schaefer said. Don't engage directly. He held her look. But Callow's whole method depends on people feeling isolated, like they're fighting something they can't see. I want him to know we can see it. He paused. I want him to know there are 2 of us. She understood what he meant by 2. Not just herself as a practical asset, not just another set of hands. 2. A different weight entirely. Write the letter, she said. Let me read it before it goes. He wrote it that evening at the kitchen table, longhand, 3 drafts before he had it right. It was short, shorter than Callow's letters, which was deliberate. It stated that the Thornton Ranch boundary had been formally surveyed and filed with the state land authority, that the water rights claim on the Eastern Spring had been similarly filed, and that the ranch was represented by legal counsel in Red Fork. It said, in its last line, that any further correspondence should be directed to Schaefer's office. He slid it across the table to Evelyn. She read it twice. She changed 2 words. Not the meaning, just the phrasing, making it slightly more formal in the places where his anger had crept into the sentence structure, which was understandable but handed Callow something to use. Silas read the changes, nodded. Better. It's still your letter, she said. I know. He folded it. I'm going to sign it with both our names. She had not suggested this. She looked at him. You're on the water rights filing, he said. You're on the state survey as a party of interest. Leaving your name off this letter is inconsistent with the record. He held her look. It's also not accurate to how this is. She thought about what it meant. Her name on a letter to a man who had already demonstrated he was capable of sending deputies to kick in doors. She thought about Rosie, about what stability looked like and what risks it required. She thought about the fact that she had been making herself smaller for 8 months, keeping her name off things, trying to take up the least possible space, and where that had gotten her. All right, she said, both names. The letter went to Millhaven with Pete the following morning. They heard nothing from Callow for 3 weeks. What they got instead, at the end of those 3 weeks, was a letter from Schaefer, brief, professional, with good news written in the careful way lawyers wrote good news, which was to say cautiously but unmistakably. The boundary review that Gruder had opened had been suspended. The reason given was insufficient grounds following review of existing documentation. Schaefer's note added that Gruder had apparently decided that Ackerman's survey was not the hill he wanted to die on, and that in his experience this was how Callow's operations retreated, not with admission, but with silence. It was not over. Schaefer was careful to say that. Callow might return with a different approach. The water rights claim would still process over the coming months and should be monitored. But for now, silence. The particular silence that meant someone had done the calculation and decided to move on to something cheaper. Silas read the letter at the breakfast table and set it down and looked out the window for a long moment. Then he poured himself more coffee and said, Pete's coming today to look at the Southfield drainage. I know, Evelyn said. If the drainage is what I think it is, we could put in a second crop this summer. I know that too. She watched him. You're not going to say anything about the letter? He picked up his coffee. I said what I needed to say in the letter we sent him. She understood. Some men celebrated. Silas filed things away and kept moving, which was, she had come to understand, not coldness, but a kind of practicality that had kept him alive through losses that would have finished a softer man. Rosie came in from feeding the chickens with Rotten's latest grievance, apparently unresolved based on her expression. Rotten pecked me again, she said. She pecks everyone, Silas said. She pecks me more. Because you're the one who renamed her. Rosie sat down and looked at her oatmeal. Cutler is the biggest rabbit now, she said, in the tone of a person making an important point through an apparently unrelated observation. He was the smallest one. Neither adult responded to this immediately. Then Silas said, I heard from Schaefer this morning. Rosie looked up. The boundary review was suspended, he said. Gruder dropped it. Rosie looked at him, then at Evelyn. Her face went through something complicated, relief and something harder to name, the particular expression of a child who has been carrying a weight they weren't supposed to know about. So we're staying, she said. Evelyn said, yes, we're staying. Rosie looked at her oatmeal. She picked up her spoon. Good, she said. I haven't finished the map yet. Spring came late to the mountain, the way it always did at elevation, grudging and incremental, snow retreating in patches, the ground emerging wet and dark and willing. Evelyn watched it from the kitchen window most mornings while she had the first coffee of the day, the light coming earlier, the ridge losing its white in stages, the east quarter greening around the channel where the water ran. She had not expected to be watching spring arrive here. She had not expected, when she'd lifted that gate latch in November, to be watching anything arrive anywhere. She'd been in the part of a life where you stopped expecting arrival and just tried to navigate transit. One place to the next. Endure the in-between. Spring arriving somewhere you'd decided to stay was a different thing entirely. It had a different weight. The south field planting went in on a Thursday in late April. Silas and Pete and Evelyn working the rows from first light, Rosie hauling seed in the old garden cart with Bishop walking beside her because he had appointed himself her agricultural assistant sometime in January and had not rescinded the appointment. The soil was better than the previous year's yield suggested, rested, improved by the winter moisture from the channel, responsive under the seed drill in the way good ground was responsive. Pete walked the rows in the afternoon and said it was the best prepared south field he'd seen on this property. He didn't say it to Silas. He said it to the field, more or less, the way a man his age said things he meant without wanting to make them a production. Evelyn heard it and kept working. In May, she drove to Millhaven alone for the first time and came back with twice the money the trip usually produced because she'd brought not just eggs and preserves but 3 dozen seed packets from the kitchen garden that she'd packaged herself. And Margaret Purcell had taken all of them at a price Evelyn had set and Purcell had agreed to without negotiating, which was either respect or desperation, and Evelyn didn't particularly mind which. She was counting the money at the kitchen table when Silas came in from the barn, and he looked at the bills and coins laid out in their columns, and he said, "That's more than usual." "The seed packets," she said. "I think we can do that regularly. People want kitchen garden starts, not just seeds. If I pot some of the seedlings this winter." "You're already planning next winter," he said. "I'm planning this fall so that next winter works," she said. "There's a difference." He sat down across from her. He had the look he sometimes got in the evenings, something open in it, the caution pulled back. He'd been doing that more often, letting things show that he used to redirect away from. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know," she said. "You've been thinking it for a while." He looked at her. "How long?" "Since Red Fork," she said. "Maybe before." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, Rosie was in the yard with Bishop and could be heard having a one-sided conversation with one of the rabbits about whether its behavior was acceptable. The sound of her voice through the open window was so ordinary and so settled that it almost didn't register anymore, which was, Evelyn thought, exactly what settled sounded like. You stopped noticing it because it was simply there. "I'm not good at this," Silas said. "At what specifically?" "At saying things. Before I've thought them all the way through." He put his hands flat on the table. "Claire used to say I'd think something for 6 months, and then say it like it was obvious, and by then she'd already moved on to something else. I'm not Clara, Evelyn said. I know you're not. He held her look. What I'm trying to say, what I've been thinking since Red Fork, or maybe before, is that you're already here, not just working here. Here. He paused. And I'd like that to be not just the arrangement we made in November. She looked at him across the table with the money counted out between them, the practical evidence of a practical life that worked, that was working, that was more than working, and she thought about what it was to build something on ground you'd tested by living on it, not on promise or hope or what a person seemed like in the first impression. On the actual days, the fence work and the numbers paper and the letter they'd signed together and the 4 days in Red Fork and everything in between. I'd like that too, she said. He nodded. Not a dramatic moment, not a scene, just two people at a kitchen table with money between them and a child outside talking to a rabbit and a dog that had one ear pointed wrong, agreeing about the thing they'd been agreeing about for months without saying so. You'll need to ask Rosie, Evelyn said. I know that. She'll have conditions. I'd be worried if she didn't. He picked up one of the coins and turned it in his fingers and set it back down. I'd like to do it properly. Ask you both. You can ask me whenever you want, Evelyn said. I just told you yes. I want to do it at the right time. Then pick the right time. She started putting the money in order. Don't think about it for 6 months. Something crossed his face, almost a full smile, the closest she'd seen to the real version. I'll think about it for 1 month. 3 weeks, she said. 4, he said. Done, she said. He was right that it needed to be done properly. He took his time, just under 4 weeks, which she noticed and didn't mention, and then one evening in late May, when the days had gotten long and warm enough to sit on the porch after dinner, he asked them both. He'd thought about it, and that was visible. He'd thought about how to say it in a way that included Rosie as a full party and not an afterthought, and the result was that he asked them together, Evelyn and Rosie side by side on the porch steps, and he stood in the yard below them and said what he wanted to say without dressing it up, which was that he wanted them to stay, not as an arrangement, but as the people this ranch belonged to. Rosie listened to the whole thing with her hands folded in her lap and Bishop's head resting on her knee. When he finished, she looked at him for a moment with the considering expression she brought to important questions. If we stay, she said, is this our house? Yes, he said. And Bishop is our dog? Bishop already decided that on his own. I'm just making it official. She looked at Evelyn. Evelyn said, What do you think? Rosie looked at the yard, at the garden she'd planted in April, the flower bed along the east fence that was her project and no one else's, the chicken pen where Rotten held court with her subjects. She looked at the barn and the south field and the ridge above where the spring ran through the rock. I think, she said slowly, that I want to finish the map first. Silas looked at her. The map's not finished, she said. It should be finished before we make it official, so it shows everything that's really here. He was quiet for a moment. How long will that take? A week, she said. Maybe 2. I want to add the spring source, and the planting in the south field, and the rabbit pen. She paused. And the names. The names, he said. Your name, Mama's name, my name. She looked at the map she'd been carrying around for months, unfolded it to show them, still growing, still accumulating details. The ranch in all its imperfect specificity, rendered in careful pencil on pieces of brown paper taped together. Maps should show who's there, she said. Otherwise, they're just pictures of land. Silas looked at the map for a long moment. At the handwriting in the corners, the notations, the waterline with its date, the note about soft ground that had led them to the spring. All of it Rosie's. All of it built from paying attention to the thing in front of her and writing it down. Take the time you need, he said. It should be done right. She finished the map in 10 days. She spread it on the kitchen table, all 5 pieces of brown paper, the full property in careful scale, every building and fence and field and water source, and in the lower right corner, where maps usually put their legend, she had written 3 names in her best printing: Silas Thornton, Evelyn Harper, Rosie Harper, and below the names a date, and below the date a single word, home. They stood around the table and looked at it. The scale's better than the first version, Pete said, from where he was leaning against the counter with his coffee, because Pete had been there when the map started and it seemed right that he was there when it finished. I practiced, Rosie said. Silas looked at the three names in the corner for a long time. He touched the edge of the paper, not covering the names, just the edge. The way you touch something you're not sure is real yet. It's good, he said. It's a good map. That summer, the South Field produced better than Silas had seen it produce in 10 years. The water from the spring held steady. Rosie's measurement record showed a consistent level through June and July. The table stable in a way that the well alone had never managed. The egg sales continued. The preserves sold out in July, which meant Evelyn had underestimated demand and was already revising her estimate for the fall production. She wrote this in a letter to Schaefer, along with the note that the water rights filing had cleared and was now formally on record, which he had already confirmed but which she wanted to acknowledge because Schaefer had worked hard for them, and she believed in acknowledging work. Callow made no further contact. Schaefer said this was not uncommon. Men who operated the way Callow operated moved through targets the way water moved through terrain, always finding the path of least resistance. They'd made the resistance expensive enough that the path led elsewhere. That was the most you could usually say. It was enough. On a morning in August, Evelyn was in the kitchen garden when she heard Rosie calling her name from the east fence. Not urgently, the tone wasn't urgent, but insistent, the way Rosie was insistent when she'd found something she thought mattered. She walked out to the fence. Rosie was crouching at the base of the east slope, above the channel, in a spot that wasn't on the original route between anywhere and anywhere else. Bishop was sitting beside her, both ears up, which was his alert posture. "What?" Evelyn said. Rosie pointed. At the base of the rock face, just above the channel, something was growing. A small cluster of plants she hadn't seen there before, low and green against the gray stone. Evelyn crouched beside her. "Wild strawberries," Rosie said. "They need water to grow, and there was no water here before." She was right. The strawberries were following the moisture from the spring, finding their way to the surface along the channel's path. Small, impractical things that nobody had planted and nobody had planned for, growing because the conditions had been made right for things to grow. Evelyn sat back on her heels and looked at them. "Can we eat them?" Rosie asked. "When they're ripe." "When will that be?" "Another month. Maybe 6 weeks." Rosie sat down fully in the grass beside the plants, which was her way of deciding she was staying for a while. Bishop lay down too. The morning was warm and still, and the valley below the ranch sat green in the August light. And up the slope the spring ran through the rock with its steady cold persistence, and the strawberries were there because the water was there. And the water was there because a child had written down what she noticed. Evelyn stayed crouched in the grass and looked at the ranch below her, the house with its smoke, the south field in its midsummer green, the barn with the patched roof that didn't leak anymore, the chicken pen and the rabbit run and the garden she'd planted in April that had come in better than she'd expected. She thought about a woman who'd come through a gate with nothing except a child and 2 bundles and a willingness to work, not knowing what she was walking into. She had not walked in to rescue. She wanted to be clear about that in her own mind, because the story could be told that way, and it would be wrong. She'd walked into an exchange, her labor and her attention and her stubbornness against a man's willingness to open a door, and then, slowly, the rest of himself. Neither of them had saved the other. They'd both been people in partial states of ruin who had turned out to be better in combination than separately, which was the most honest thing you could say about how any good partnership came to exist. Rosie had not been saved either. Rosie had been given conditions, warmth, steadiness, the plain ordinary fact of the same place and the same people on consecutive days, and had done her own recovering. Children did that. They didn't need rescuing so much as they needed something solid to push against, something that held when they pushed. What she had learned in the last 9 months, or relearned or remembered from the time before grief had made everything small and tactical, was that paying attention was not a minor thing. It was the thing. Rosie noticed the soft ground. Rosie measured the well every morning. Rosie made the map because she wanted to know what was really there. None of it was dramatic. All of it was necessary. The well came back because a child had written "soft ground, wet and morning" on the corner of a piece of brown paper, and nobody had told her she should. You couldn't always predict what would matter. You could only keep your eyes open and write it down. "Mama," Rosie said. "Yeah." "Do you think the spring was always there?" Evelyn looked at the rock face, at the water moving through its opened fracture, at the strawberries that had followed the moisture to the surface. Yes, she said. I think it was always there. Then why didn't anyone find it? She thought about that. Honestly, the way the question deserved. Because finding something requires believing it's there first, she said, even just enough to look. Rosie was quiet, turning this over. Mr. Thornton believed it. He wasn't sure, Evelyn said. But he dug anyway. Is that the same thing? Close enough, she said. That's usually how it works. You're not sure, but you think it's possible, and possible is enough to pick up the shovel. Rosie plucked a stem of grass and turned it in her fingers. I was sure, she said. I know you were. I wasn't being brave, I just knew it was there, from the ground being soft. Sometimes knowing and being brave are the same thing, Evelyn said, and sometimes they're different, and it doesn't matter which one it is as long as you tell someone about the soft ground. Rosie was quiet for a while. Then, I'm going to add the strawberries to the map. Of course you are. They should be there. They're part of the ranch now. Then put them on the map. Rosie stood up, brushed the grass off her dress. She looked at the plants one more time, these small, uninvited things that had arrived because the conditions became right for them. And then she turned and walked back toward the house with Bishop at her heels, already composing in her head whatever mark she would use to indicate wild strawberries on a hand-drawn map of a mountain ranch. Evelyn stayed at the rock face a little longer. She put her hand against the stone the way Silas had done on the day they found the spring, palm flat, feeling for the cold of moving water beneath. It was there, still there, patient and indifferent and reliable in the way that water and rock was reliable, not because it wanted to be, but because that was simply its nature. She pushed herself up from her crouch. Her knees ached, which they'd started doing sometime in the last months, and which she had decided not to be troubled by because it was just the body keeping honest records of the work it had done. She walked back to the house. Through the kitchen window, she could see Rosie already at the table with the map spread out and a pencil in her hand, her head bent, adding the latest thing she'd noticed to the ongoing record of the ranch. Silas was at the fence on the south side, checking the posts on the new section they'd run in June. He saw her coming and waited, the way he waited for things. Without impatience, without performing patience, just standing in the fact of it. Rosie found wild strawberries at the base of the east slope, she said, where the spring comes through. They followed the moisture. He looked at the slope. I'll fence them off so the rabbits don't get there first. Rosie would appreciate that. He went back to the fence post he'd been checking. She picked up the other end of the rail and held it while he drove the nail, and the sound of the hammer in the warm August air went out across the valley and came back as nothing, absorbed by the mountain the way the mountain absorbed everything, without comment, without preference, just holding all of it inside its plain, enormous fact. They had not fixed everything. They were not, in any version of the word, done. There would be more hard winters and more things that failed and more calculations that didn't come out right. And Callow, or someone like Callow, would probably come back in a different form because that was the nature of that kind of pressure. The bank would have opinions. The land would have dry years. The map would need new pages. But the spring ran. The south field was green. Rosie was adding strawberries to the record. And a man who had spent 7 years learning to be very good at being alone had handed her a hammer 9 months ago without making a speech about it. And she had taken it and started working. And here they were on a Tuesday morning in August with the fence solid and the water running and a child's careful map on the kitchen table showing every true thing about the ground they stood on. It was not a perfect life. It was just the life that had opened up when one person chose not to turn away. That was the thing about kindness. Not the greeting card version, not the easy kind you offered when it cost you nothing. The real kind. The kind Silas had offered on a November evening when he'd opened a door to a woman he didn't know with a sick child and nothing to offer except the ability to work. That kind of kindness was not warm and comfortable. It was a decision made in uncertainty, an opening of the gate when you didn't know what was going to walk through it. And what had walked through in the end was not a burden or a complication or even a rescue story. It was just people, imperfect and practical and stubborn and paying attention, finding the spring that was always there.